What happens when a humble servant is locked away in a cold, dark dungeon by a ruthless king, with no explanation, no trial, and no one to help her? And what if the person who saves her is another king? This is not just a story about love. It's about secrets buried in silence, power battles behind golden thrones, and a connection so deep that it defies everything. As you listen, you'll uncover a truth more powerful than any sword, and a romance that will make your heart ache, but not in the way you expect. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this reading. The sound of iron echoed through the corridors as Elaine was dragged by the castle guards into the depths of the dungeon. Her screams faded between the cold stone walls, ignored by everyone. No one explained why a simple palace servant had been taken away with such violence. The cell reeked of mold and abandonment, and there, without understanding the reason for her imprisonment, she wept silently, feeling her soul shatter into pieces. The cruel and paranoid King Thalon had merely said that she knew too much. Elaine pressed her back against the damp stone wall, her magnificent chestnut hair now matted with dirt and tears. At 40, she had spent decades serving in the castle, her beauty undiminished by time, only enhanced by the quiet dignity she carried. Now that dignity was being stripped away with every passing hour in this forgotten corner of the kingdom. "Please," she whispered to the darkness, her voice breaking. "What have I done? I'm just a servant." But only the dripping of water from the ceiling answered her pleas. Days passed, and no one came to see her. The shadows of the cell began to blend with her memories of freedom. The gardens she watered, the clothes she washed, the eyes of a young prince who once smiled at her. But nothing made sense. Why her? What could she possibly know that would threaten a king? Each boot step in the frozen corridors made her heart stop, expecting it to be her end. The food, if it could be called that, arrived once a day, pushed through a small opening at the bottom of the heavy wooden door. Elaine tried to keep track of time by counting these meager meals, but even that became difficult as hunger and fear clouded her mind. On what she believed to be the 6th day, something changed. The usual guard who brought her food was accompanied by another, their hushed voices carrying through the small opening. "The king is obsessed with her. Says she's dangerous," one whispered. "Her? She's just a servant. What could she possibly know? Something about her past, I reckon. There are rumors." Their voices faded as they moved away, leaving Elaine with more questions than answers. What about her past? As far as she knew, she was born to a seamstress who died when Elaine was young, leaving her to grow up in the castle's service. There was nothing remarkable about her life, except perhaps her inexplicable ability to read, something uncommon for someone of her station. That night, unable to sleep on the cold stone floor, Elaine closed her eyes and thought of her mother. The memories were hazy, but there was warmth there, a woman with golden hair like hers, singing softly while working on beautiful gowns that seemed too fine for the humble cottage they lived in. There was a necklace, too, with a strange symbol that her mother always kept hidden beneath her clothes. When Elaine was taken to serve at the castle, the necklace was the only thing she had left of her mother, the necklace that was ripped from her neck the day the guards came for her. In another kingdom far away, King Dorian of Harwald was preparing for a diplomatic visit to Thalon. At 42, Dorian was in his prime, a tall, imposing figure with intelligent eyes and a reputation for integrity that few monarchs could match. His kingdom prospered under his just rule, but maintaining peace with the volatile Thalon had become increasingly difficult. "Your Majesty," his advisor, Lord Garrick, approached as servants packed the royal carriage. "Are you certain this visit is wise? King Thalon has been unpredictable of late." Dorian fastened his royal cloak, embroidered with the wolf symbol of Harwald. "Which is precisely why I must go, Garrick. Unpredictable kings make for unstable kingdoms, and unstable kingdoms make for dangerous neighbors." Garrick nodded reluctantly. "The council fears he seeks to provoke a conflict." "Then I shall give him no cause," Dorian replied, his voice firm but calm. "We go with an open hand, not a raised fist." The journey to Thalon took 3 days, through forests that grew darker and more twisted as they approached the neighboring kingdom. Dorian noticed how the villages became sparser, the faces of the people more guarded. Thalon's realm was rich in resources, yet its people looked worn and fearful. Upon arriving at Thalon's imposing castle, all sharp angles and black stone, so unlike the warm sandstone of Harwald, Dorian was greeted with cold formality. King Thalon himself, a gaunt man whose crown seemed too heavy for his head, welcomed him with a smile that never reached his eyes. "King Dorian." Thalon's voice slithered through the great hall. "How generous of you to travel so far. I trust your journey was pleasant?" "As pleasant as journeys can be in these uncertain times," Dorian replied diplomatically, noting the excessive number of guards lining the hall. "I bring greetings from Harwald and hopes for continued peace between our realms." That evening, at a feast where the wine flowed freely but conversation remained stifled, Dorian observed the court of Thalon, the nervous laughter, the careful words, the way everyone watched their king for cues on how to behave. It was a court ruled by fear, not respect. As servants cleared away the remnants of the meal, a young guard bumped into Dorian's chair, spilling wine on the stone floor. Falling to his knees to clean it, the guard whispered, so quickly Dorian almost missed it, "The king keeps a woman in the dungeon, but no one knows who she is." Before Dorian could react, the guard was gone, lost among the servants. The words lingered in his mind, unsettling him deeply. A woman in the dungeon? It wasn't unusual for a king to imprison criminals, but the secretive nature of this imprisonment piqued his interest. That night, in his guest chambers, Dorian could not sleep. The guard's words echoed in his thoughts. There was something about the tone, the urgency, the fear, that suggested this was no ordinary prisoner. And if there was one thing Dorian could not abide, it was injustice. The next morning, during negotiations over trade routes and border patrols, Dorian made an unusual request. "I would be interested in seeing more of your magnificent castle, King Thalon. Perhaps even those parts visitors do not typically see." Thalon's eyes narrowed slightly. "What parts interest you, King Dorian?" "I have heard your dungeons are quite secure." Dorian held Thalon's gaze steadily. "In Harwald, we are considering renovations to our own. I would value seeing how Thalon handles such matters." A tense silence fell over the room. Thalon's advisors exchanged nervous glances, but Thalon himself merely smiled. A cold, reptilian smile. "Of course," he said finally. "What use is diplomacy, if not to share knowledge? I shall arrange for you to tour the dungeons this afternoon." As Dorian left the negotiation table, he felt a prickle of foreboding. He had navigated delicate political waters all his life, but something told him he was about to discover a secret that would change everything, not just for the kingdoms, but for him personally. And somewhere in the darkness below, Elaine closed her eyes and dreamed of sunlight she feared she would never see again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as Dorian prepared to descend into the depths of Thalon's castle. He had dismissed his own guards, insisting this was merely an architectural inspection, though Lord Garrick had protested vehemently. "This feels like a trap, Your Majesty," Garrick had whispered urgently before Dorian departed. "Let me accompany you at least." "A king accompanied by his guards to inspect a dungeon suggests suspicion," Dorian replied, adjusting the simple silver clasp on his cloak. "And suspicion breeds hostility. I'll go alone." Now, as a stern-faced captain of Thalon's guard led him down winding stone stairs, Dorian maintained his composed exterior while his senses heightened. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of mildew and human misery. Torches flickered at increasingly distant intervals, casting more shadows than light. "How many prisoners do you typically house here?" Dorian asked casually, his voice echoing against the narrow walls. The captain gave a non-committal grunt. "Depends on His Majesty's judgment. Some days more, some days less." "And what crimes merit imprisonment in Thalon?" The guard's shoulders stiffened. "That's not for me to say, Your Majesty. I just follow orders." They reached a heavy iron door guarded by 2 soldiers who straightened immediately upon seeing their captain. Beyond the door stretched a long corridor lined with cells on either side. Most appeared empty, though Dorian could hear occasional whimpers and coughs from the darkness. "These are primarily for drunks and brawlers," the captain explained, clearly reciting a prepared speech. "Minor offenders serve a few days, then return to their lives properly chastened." Dorian nodded, noting how clean this section appeared, almost staged. "And the more serious offenders?" The captain hesitated before gesturing toward another door at the corridor's end. "Through there. Political prisoners, traitors, spies. Not many survive long enough to be released." The words hung in the air between them, a tacit acknowledgement of Thalon's brutal justice. Dorian maintained his diplomatic mask as they approached the second door. "I'm particularly interested in your containment methods for high-value prisoners," he said. "Those who might possess sensitive information." Something flickered in the captain's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. After a moment's hesitation, he unlocked the door, revealing a narrower, damper corridor with fewer torches and a more oppressive darkness. The cells here had smaller barred windows in the doors rather than open grates. They walked slowly past several empty cells before the captain paused, almost imperceptibly, near one door. Dorian caught the slight hesitation and stopped, turning toward the cell. "This one appears occupied," he observed, peering through the small window. At first, he could see nothing in the gloom. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he discerned a figure huddled in the corner, a woman with tangled golden hair, her head bowed as if in prayer. Even in that position of defeat, there was something dignified about her posture. "This prisoner is not part of the tour," the captain said stiffly. "King Thalon's express orders." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "I was under the impression I had permission to inspect all areas of your dungeon, unless there's something about this particular prisoner that King Thalon wishes to hide from diplomatic eyes." The captain shifted uncomfortably, caught between conflicting orders. Dorian pressed his advantage. "I merely wish to observe your methods. A brief look, nothing more." After a tense moment, the captain reluctantly produced a ring of keys and unlocked the door. "5 minutes, Your Majesty. No more." The cell door swung open with a grating sound that echoed through the corridor. The woman's head snapped up, fear evident in her posture, though her face remained in shadow. "Leave us," Dorian commanded the captain, who began to protest. "Just outside the door. I assure you, I am quite capable of defending myself against a half-starved prisoner, should the need arise." Once alone, Dorian stepped fully into the cell, allowing the meager light from the corridor to illuminate his features. The woman regarded him warily, her back pressed against the damp stone wall. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse but surprisingly steady. "I am Dorian, King of Harwald," he answered, deliberately keeping his distance. "And you are?" The woman studied him with piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Despite the dirt on her face and the tatters of her once fine servant's dress, she possessed a striking beauty. High cheekbones, an elegant neck, and those extraordinary eyes that assessed him with intelligence. "Elaine," she replied simply, "though I doubt you came to a dungeon to make my acquaintance, Your Majesty." Dorian was struck by her composure. Most prisoners would beg for mercy or proclaim their innocence to any visitor, especially one of royal blood. But this woman watched him with caution and something else, a quiet dignity that intrigued him. "Why are you here, Elaine?" he asked softly, moving closer and crouching to her level. She gave a bitter laugh that contained no humor. "That is the question I've asked every day for nearly a week. I'm a servant, was a servant, in the upper chambers. I polished silver and turned down beds. Then guards came, accused me of spying, and threw me here." "Spying for whom?" "They didn't say. King Thalon claimed I knew too much, but wouldn't explain what I supposedly knew." Her fingers unconsciously moved to her neck, touching a spot where something had once been. "They took my mother's necklace, the only thing I had of her." Dorian observed this gesture, filing away the detail. "And do you know secrets worth imprisoning you for?" Elaine met his gaze directly. "I know the king has nightmares that make him scream like a child. I know which nobles leave his chambers with bruises they didn't arrive with. I know the queen hasn't left her tower in 3 months." She paused. "But servants always know such things. We're like furniture, present but unseen." A commotion in the corridor interrupted them. The captain's voice rose, arguing with someone. Dorian straightened just as the cell door swung open wider, revealing King Thalon himself, his thin face contorted with barely controlled rage. "I don't recall extending my hospitality to include private conversations with my prisoners, King Dorian," Thalon said, ice in his voice. Dorian maintained his calm demeanor. "Forgive me. I was merely satisfying my curiosity about your containment methods. This prisoner seems harmless enough. A servant accused of spying, she tells me." Thalon's gaze darted to Elaine, who had lowered her eyes, becoming once again the invisible servant. "She is more dangerous than she appears, a skilled manipulator and liar." "Indeed?" Dorian replied mildly. "How interesting that you would consider a servant such a threat." The two kings regarded each other in tense silence, a silent battle of wills conducted in the dank cell. Elaine remained perfectly still, as if hoping to fade into the stones behind her. "I believe I've seen enough of your dungeons," Dorian finally said. "They are most instructive." Thalon's thin lips curved in a smile that resembled a wound. "I'm pleased you found them educational. Shall we return to more pleasant surroundings? The evening meal awaits." As Dorian followed Thalon from the cell, he glanced back at Elaine. For a brief moment their eyes met, and in hers he saw not a plea for help, but a spark, resilient and defiant, despite her circumstances. The heavy door clanged shut behind them. That evening, at another elaborate feast where the food was rich but the conversation stilted, Dorian observed King Thalon with new eyes. What secret could a simple servant possess that would so threaten a king? The question nagged at him throughout the meal, through the entertainments that followed, and into the night as he lay awake in his chambers. Before dawn, Dorian summoned Lord Garrick to his rooms. "I need you to learn everything you can about a prisoner named Elaine," he instructed in hushed tones. "A servant from the upper chambers, imprisoned for alleged espionage." Garrick frowned. "Is this wise, Your Majesty? Involving ourselves in Thalon's internal affairs could jeopardize our negotiations." "There is something wrong here, Garrick," Dorian replied, his voice firm. "A woman locked away without charge or trial, a king personally concerned with her imprisonment. Find out what you can, discreetly." By midday, Garrick had returned with troubling information. "The servants speak of her in whispers," he reported. "She was well liked, educated beyond her station. Some say the king feared her because she resembled someone, a noble lady from years ago. Others claim she discovered something in the king's private chambers while cleaning, but all agree her arrest was sudden and without public explanation." Dorian paced the length of his chambers. "And what of our negotiations?" "Proceeding as expected. King Thalon is demanding higher tariffs for river access but seems willing to compromise on the border patrols." "Good, then we have leverage." Dorian stopped pacing, his decision made. "Today we will concede on the tariffs, but in exchange I want something unexpected." That afternoon, as the final terms were being drafted, Dorian cleared his throat. "One additional matter, King Thalon. As a gesture of goodwill between our kingdoms, I request the release of the prisoner Elaine into my custody." The chamber fell silent. Thalon's advisors exchanged alarmed glances while their king remained perfectly still, only the whitening of his knuckles on the armrest betraying his rage. "That is an unusual request," Thalon said carefully. "Why would the king of Harwald concern himself with a common criminal from another realm?" Dorian maintained his diplomatic smile. "Call it a royal whim. Perhaps I need a new servant who knows how to polish silver properly." "She is a traitor and spy," Thalon countered, his voice rising slightly. "Hardly suitable for royal service." "Then you'll hardly miss her," Dorian replied smoothly. "And I'm willing to increase my concession on the tariffs by 5%. The advisors murmured at this. It was a significant economic advantage. Thalon's face darkened as he calculated his options. Refusing would raise questions about why a mere servant warranted such protection. Accepting meant losing whatever leverage the woman represented. "You may come to regret this request," Thalon said finally. "But very well. Take the woman. Consider her part of the diplomatic exchange." Dorian inclined his head, careful not to show the relief he felt. Generous of you, King Thalon. I trust she will be ready to depart with my retinue at dawn. She will be delivered to your carriage, Thalon replied coldly. Though I warn you, watch her closely. She is not what she seems. Later, as Dorian supervised the packing of his belongings, Garrick approached with concern etched on his face. Forgive me, Your Majesty, but is this prisoner worth potentially souring relations with Thalon? The council will question your judgment. Dorian paused, considering his advisor's words. There are times, Garrick, when a king must follow his instincts rather than political expediency. Something is not right here, and that woman is the key to understanding what. And if she proves dangerous, as Thalon claims, then we will have learned something valuable about our neighbor, Dorian replied. Either way, I could not leave her in that cell, not after seeing her eyes. Garrick looked puzzled. Her eyes, sire? Yes, Dorian said softly. They held the same look I've seen in wounded wolves, proud, fierce, and unwilling to surrender even when death seemed certain. He turned to the window, gazing toward the dark silhouette of Thalon's castle against the night sky. Those are not the eyes of a mere servant, Garrick, and I intend to discover who she truly is. Dawn broke with reluctant fingers of light over Thalon's somber castle as Dorian's retinue prepared for departure. The courtyard bustled with activity, horses snorting plumes of vapor into the chill morning air, servants securing the last of the baggage, guards checking weapons and armor. Dorian stood beside his ornate carriage, outwardly calm but inwardly tense as he watched the castle entrance. Do you think Thalon will honor his word? Lord Garrick muttered, adjusting his riding gloves. He will, Dorian replied with quiet certainty. Refusing now would raise too many questions among the other kingdoms. As if summoned by his words, the heavy castle doors groaned open. 2 guards emerged, flanking a slight figure in a hooded gray cloak. Elaine walked with measured steps, her head bowed, hands bound before her with thin rope. Even in this position of submission, she carried herself with unmistakable grace. King Thalon appeared behind them, his thin frame rigid with barely contained fury. He descended the steps with deliberate slowness, stopping before Dorian. As promised, the prisoner, Thalon announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Though I maintain this is a grave error in judgment on your part. Dorian inclined his head slightly. Your concern is noted, King Thalon. Harwald thanks you for this gesture of diplomatic goodwill. Thalon's eyes narrowed. One final condition. She remains bound until you cross the border. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. She may appear harmless, but appearances can be deceiving. Remember that, King Dorian? I rarely forget important lessons, Dorian replied evenly, meeting Thalon's gaze without flinching. With a sharp gesture, Thalon signaled the guards to bring Elaine forward. As they pushed her toward Dorian, she stumbled slightly. Dorian stepped forward, catching her arm to steady her. Careful, he said softly. Through the shadow of her hood, he glimpsed her face, paler than in the dungeon, with dark circles beneath those remarkable blue eyes, but still composed. Thank you, Your Majesty, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dorian helped her into the carriage, noting how she winced at the brightness of day after so long in darkness. He turned back to Thalon, offering a formal bow. Until we meet again, King Thalon, may peace continue between our realms. Thalon's smile was brittle as glass. Indeed. Safe journey, King Dorian. Mind how you guard your acquisitions. The procession departed, passing beneath the massive gatehouse and onto the road that would lead them back to Harwald. Inside the royal carriage, Elaine sat rigidly on the plush seat, her bound hands resting in her lap. Across from her, Dorian studied her with undisguised curiosity. You can remove your hood now, he said gently. The sun will do you good after so many days underground. Hesitantly, Elaine pushed back the hood with her bound hands, blinking in the light that streamed through the carriage windows. The sunlight revealed more of her features, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, the proud set of her jaw, the natural elegance of her profile that seemed at odds with her claimed status. Why did you do this? She asked abruptly, her direct gaze unsettling in its intensity. Free a prisoner you know nothing about from another king's dungeon? Dorian considered her question for a moment. Let's say I found the circumstances of your imprisonment troubling. Troubling enough to risk diplomatic relations, to pay extra in trade tariffs? She shook her head. Kings don't make such decisions on whims, despite what you told Thalon. A smile touched Dorian's lips. You have a keen ear for negotiations conducted behind closed doors. Servants hear everything, she replied simply. We're trained to be invisible, not deaf. Dorian reached forward and untied the ropes binding her wrists, noting the raw skin beneath. To answer your question, no, kings shouldn't make decisions on whims, but sometimes they must trust their instincts. And my instinct tells me your imprisonment was unjust. Elaine rubbed her freed wrists, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face before she composed herself again. Thank you, she said softly, though I'm not certain what happens now. Am I truly free, or merely exchanging one form of captivity for another? You are under my protection, not my imprisonment, Dorian clarified. Though until we understand why Thalon was so determined to keep you locked away, that protection may need to be comprehensive. She nodded, accepting this reality with surprising equanimity. And what will be my role in Harwald? You mentioned needing someone to polish silver. Dorian chuckled. That was merely a convenient excuse. You will be given comfortable quarters in the castle, time to recover, and then, he paused, studying her face. Perhaps you might help us understand what makes King Thalon consider a servant so dangerous. Elaine looked away, her gaze fixing on the passing landscape, rolling hills giving way to forests as they moved farther from Thalon's borders. I truly don't know, she admitted. I've served in the castle since I was a child. I can read and write, which is unusual for someone of my station, but hardly threatening. Who taught you to read? Dorian asked, intrigued by this detail. A shadow crossed her face. My mother before she died. She was different, not like the other village women. She spoke like nobility sometimes when she forgot herself. Elaine touched her neck again, fingers searching for the missing necklace. She left me only a necklace with a strange symbol. Thalon's guards took it when they arrested me. Dorian made a mental note of this detail. What sort of symbol? A crescent moon embracing a star with a small sword beneath, she described, tracing the pattern in the air. Worked in silver with tiny blue stones. Nothing valuable, but it was all I had of her. The carriage fell silent as they continued their journey, the rhythmic sway lulling them into contemplation. Outside, the forests of Thalon, dark and oppressive, gradually gave way to meadows dotted with wildflowers as they approached Harwald's borders. Your land is beautiful, Elaine observed as they crossed a stone bridge spanning a clear, rushing river. The air feels lighter here. That's what many say, Dorian replied, watching her expression soften as she took in the landscape. Harwald has been blessed with fertile lands and temperate weather, but a kingdom is more than its natural bounty. It's the spirit of its people that truly defines it. By late afternoon, they reached the first village of Harwald. Unlike the fearful faces in Thalon's territories, the villagers here emerged from their homes with genuine smiles, waving at the royal procession. Children ran alongside the carriage, laughing and throwing flower petals. Elaine watched this display with undisguised wonder. They truly love you, she murmured. They love what the crown represents, Dorian corrected gently. Safety, justice, prosperity. Any ruler who provides these earns their people's affection. She gave him a sidelong glance. You speak as though it's simple. Yet King Thalon rules with fear and still wears his crown. For now, Dorian replied. But fear builds resentment, and resentment eventually overthrows even the most secure throne. True power lies in earning loyalty through justice. The journey continued for 2 more days, each mile bringing more color and life to the landscape. Elaine gradually became more animated, asking questions about Harwald's customs, history, and people. Dorian found himself impressed by her quick intelligence and thoughtful observations. On the evening of the 3rd day, they crested a hill to reveal Harwald Castle in the distance, a magnificent structure of golden sandstone with soaring towers and expansive gardens nestled beside a sparkling lake. Unlike Thalan's fortress of dark stone and sharp angles, Harwald Castle seemed to rise organically from the landscape, embraced by the surrounding forests rather than imposing upon them. "It's breathtaking," Elaine whispered, leaning forward to better see through the carriage window. "Home," Dorian said simply, a warmth in his voice that hadn't been present in their previous conversations. As they approached the castle gates, Elaine's earlier animation gave way to visible anxiety. She straightened her tattered dress, trying futilely to smooth the wrinkles and brush away the dirt from her days in the dungeon. Noticing her discomfort, Dorian said, "You'll be given fresh clothing and private chambers to refresh yourself before meeting anyone else." Gratitude flickered in her eyes. "Thank you. I wouldn't want to appear before your court looking like someone who survived unjust imprisonment with dignity intact," Dorian finished for her. "There's no shame in that, but I understand the desire to face new challenges from a position of strength." The royal procession passed through the gates to the welcoming sounds of trumpets and cheering people. Servants lined the courtyard, bowing as Dorian's carriage came to a stop. He descended first, then offered his hand to help Elaine down. For a moment she hesitated, suddenly aware of the many eyes upon her, a stranger in tattered clothes emerging from the king's own carriage. Then, taking a deep breath, she placed her hand in his and stepped into the sunlight of Harwald. The head of household, Lady Marjorie, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, came forward immediately. "Your Majesty, welcome home," she said, bowing deeply before turning curious eyes to Elaine. "Lady Marjorie, this is Elaine," Dorian introduced her simply, offering no explanation for her presence. "She is our honored guest and will be staying in the East Wing. Please see that she has everything she needs: fresh clothing, a hot bath, meals, and privacy." Lady Marjorie's eyebrows rose slightly, but she merely nodded. "Of course, Your Majesty. If you'll follow me, my lady," she added, addressing Elaine with the courtesy title, despite her obvious common status. As Elaine was led away, Lord Garrick approached with a concerned expression. "The council has gathered, Your Majesty. They're eager to hear the results of the negotiations with Thalan." Dorian sighed. "No doubt they're also curious about our unexpected guest." "Word travels quickly," Garrick confirmed. "Some are already questioning the wisdom of antagonizing Thalan over a servant." "Then I shall provide them with wisdom of my own," Dorian replied firmly. "Arrange a private meeting with the inner council first. This matter requires discretion." An hour later, in the castle's council chamber, Dorian faced the skeptical expressions of his most trusted advisors as he recounted the circumstances of Elaine's imprisonment and release. "With respect, Your Majesty," Lord Merrick, the oldest counselor, spoke first. "Bringing a prisoner from Thalan, regardless of the justification, creates unnecessary complications, especially when we know nothing of her true identity or the actual reasons for her confinement." "What we know," Dorian countered, "is that King Thalan imprisoned her without trial or public accusation, then became uncharacteristically agitated when I showed interest in her case. Those facts alone warrant investigation." Lady Isolde, the only woman on the council, leaned forward. "Could she be a noble in disguise? Perhaps from a family Thalan wished to eliminate?" "Possible," Dorian acknowledged. "She carries herself with unusual dignity for a servant, and by her own account, her mother taught her to read, a rare skill for commoners. Or she could be exactly what Thalan claimed, a spy," Lord Merrick warned, "perhaps even planted to gain your sympathy and access to Harwald's court." Dorian's expression hardened slightly. "I am not blind to that possibility, Lord Merrick. She will not have free run of the castle, nor access to sensitive information, but neither will she be treated as a prisoner when no crime has been proven." The discussion continued well into the evening, with the council divided between those who supported Dorian's decision and those who questioned its prudence. Finally, they reached a compromise. Elaine would be treated as an honored guest but discreetly watched, while investigations into her background proceeded quietly. Later that night, Dorian stood alone on his private balcony, gazing at the stars scattered across the velvet darkness. The same stars, he reflected, that Elaine had been denied in her dungeon cell. What was it about her that had compelled him to intervene so dramatically? Was it merely justice or something more personal that he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock. Lady Marjorie entered, bowing briefly. "Your Majesty, I've settled your guest as instructed. I thought you might wish to know how she fares." "Please." Dorian gestured for her to continue. "She's remarkably composed for someone who's endured such hardship," Lady Marjorie reported. "Asked for books before food, if you can imagine. When I brought her to the bath chamber, she wept at the sight of clean water, tried to hide it, poor thing. But I saw." The older woman's expression softened. "Whoever she was before, sire, she's known better days than serving in Thalen's castle." Dorian nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Lady Marjorie. Please continue to see to her comfort." "There is one more thing, Your Majesty," she added hesitantly. "When helping her dress, I noticed a small birthmark on her shoulder, a crescent shape, similar to the old crest of House Virel." Dorian's attention sharpened. House Virel? The noble family from the eastern provinces that was supposedly eliminated in the border wars? "The very same, sire. It may be nothing, just an old woman's imagination. But I served Lady Virel in my youth, before her house fell, and there's something in your guest's manner that reminds me of her." After Lady Marjorie departed, Dorian remained on the balcony, his mind racing with new possibilities. If Elaine had connections to House Virel, a family Thalan had personally moved against during his father's expansion campaigns, it would explain the king's determination to keep her isolated. But it would also mean that the woman now sleeping peacefully in his castle's east wing might be far more than a simple servant with an unusual education. She might be the key to exposing decades of royal crimes and a legitimate threat to Thalan's hold on his ill-gotten territories. As the moon rose higher, casting silver light across Harwald's peaceful gardens, Dorian made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, whatever it might be. And if Elaine was indeed more than she appeared, he would ensure she received not just protection, but justice. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting golden patterns across the polished stone floor of Harwald Castle's library. Elaine stood transfixed, her fingers hovering reverently over leather-bound tomes arranged in neat rows. After a week in the castle, the luxury of clean clothes and regular meals had restored some of her vitality. But it was here, among the books, that she truly seemed to come alive. "I've never seen so many volumes in one place," she murmured, more to herself than to the king who stood watching her from the doorway. Dorian smiled, stepping into the room. "My grandfather began the collection. My father doubled it. I've added what I could. Knowledge is the truest wealth a kingdom can possess." Elaine turned, a flush rising to her cheeks when she realized she was no longer alone. She wore a simple blue dress provided by Lady Marjorie, modest compared to court fashion, but finely made and far superior to her former servant's garb. With her golden hair braided and her face no longer gaunt from hunger, her beauty was even more evident. "Your Majesty," she said, dropping into a graceful curtsy. "Forgive me for intruding." Lady Marjorie mentioned the library was open to guests. "But perhaps you misunderstand," Dorian interrupted gently. "I'm pleased to see you making use of it. Books are meant to be read, not merely displayed." He approached, stopping beside her at the shelf she'd been examining. "Have you found anything of interest?" She hesitated before answering. "Histories, mostly. I was curious about Harwald, and its relationship with Thalen over the years." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "Research into your former captor, or your new host?" "Both, I suppose," she admitted with surprising candor. "Knowledge is protection in its way." "A wise perspective," he acknowledged. "And what have you learned so far?" Elaine carefully removed a volume from the shelf, opening it to a page she had marked with a thin ribbon. "That the peace between your kingdoms has always been fragile. That 50 years ago, before either of you were born, your grandfathers fought a war over the eastern provinces." Her finger traced a map showing territories along the border. "And that several noble houses were destroyed in that conflict." Dorian studied her face carefully, including House Virel. Her expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. The book mentions them only briefly. They held lands rich in silver mines, if I recall correctly. Among other resources, Dorian confirmed. They were among the most prosperous houses in the region, until they backed the losing side in the war. Officially, the entire family perished when their estate was burned, a tragedy of conflict. And unofficially? Elaine asked softly. Dorian walked to a window, gazing out at the gardens below where courtiers strolled in the morning sunshine, blissfully ignorant of old blood feuds and buried secrets. Unofficially, he said after a moment. There were rumors that the fire was set deliberately, after the fighting had ended, that Thalon's father had ordered the elimination of certain noble houses whose lands he coveted. He turned back to her. But rumors are poor substitutes for truth, especially after decades have passed. Elaine closed the book carefully, her movements measured. Why are you telling me this, Your Majesty? Because I wonder if you might help me separate rumor from truth. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. The necklace that was taken from you. You described its symbol as a crescent moon embracing a star, with a small sword beneath. She nodded, her hand instinctively rising to her throat. Yes, my mother's. Why? Instead of answering directly, Dorian crossed to a cabinet against the far wall. From it, he withdrew a smaller, older book bound in faded blue leather. He opened it to a marked page and held it out to her. On the yellowed parchment was an illustration of a coat of arms, a crescent moon cradling a six-pointed star, with a slender sword positioned below. Beside it was written, House Virel, Defenders of the Eastern Marches. Elaine's face drained of color. Her fingers trembled as they reached out to touch the illustration. This is the symbol on my necklace. Exactly this. Lady Marjorie noticed a birthmark on your shoulder. Dorian continued gently. A crescent shape. She once served in House Virel and thought it reminiscent of their bloodline. Elaine's eyes snapped up to meet his, a mixture of confusion and dawning realization in their depths. What are you suggesting? I'm not yet suggesting anything, Dorian replied carefully. But I find it curious that a servant in Thalon's castle would possess a necklace bearing the crest of a noble house his father allegedly destroyed. A house whose lands were absorbed into Thalon's kingdom and whose silver mines still fill his treasury. Elaine sank slowly into a nearby chair, the book still clutched in her hands. My mother was a seamstress, she said, but her voice held a note of uncertainty. She died when I was young, 8 or 9 years old. I was sent to the castle to work in the kitchens. That's all I know. What was your mother's name? Dorian asked softly. Elenis, she answered. Elenis of Brookhaven Village. Dorian's expression shifted subtly. Elenis, he repeated. An unusual name. Not common among villagers. She was not common in many ways, Elaine said quietly, lost in memory. She could read and write, spoke like someone educated. Sometimes visitors would come to our cottage at night. She would send me to the loft and speak with them in whispers. I remember once, a man called her my lady, and she scolded him severely. Her brow furrowed as long dormant memories surfaced. There was a loose stone in our hearth. She kept a small wooden box beneath it with papers and the necklace. Dorian pulled another chair close, sitting at eye level with her. Elaine, I believe it's possible your mother was not a simple seamstress. She may have been Lady Elenis of House Virel, a survivor of the Purge who hid her identity to protect herself, and perhaps her child. Elaine shook her head, overwhelmed. That can't be. I'm a servant. I've always been a servant. Have you? Dorian challenged gently. You read and write. You carry yourself with natural dignity. You speak with an education no kitchen maid would receive. My mother taught me, she insisted. She wanted me to have knowledge, even if our station offered no use for it. A mother's gift to her daughter, Dorian agreed, but perhaps also a noble lady's attempt to give her heir the education befitting her true rank, even in hiding. Elaine stood abruptly, returning the book to its shelf with trembling hands. This is too much. Too sudden. She paced to the window, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. Even if what you suggest were true, and I'm not saying it is, what difference would it make now? House Virel is gone. Its lands belong to Thalon. I am still just myself. Whatever name or title might once have been attached to my blood. Dorian rose, following her to the window but maintaining a respectful distance. Names and titles may seem like empty conventions in peaceful times, but they carry weight in matters of diplomacy and succession. If you are indeed the last heir of House Virel, your very existence challenges Thalon's claim to territories he considers his by right of conquest. Understanding dawned in her eyes. That's why he imprisoned me. Not because I knew something, but because of who I might be. Perhaps, Dorian nodded, though how he discovered your potential identity remains a mystery. A sharp knock interrupted them. Lord Garrick entered, his expression grave. Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, but there's an urgent matter requiring your attention. Dorian straightened. What is it, Garrick? What? A messenger from Thalon has arrived. King Thalon demands the immediate return of his property, meaning the lady. Garrick explained, inclining his head apologetically toward Elaine. He claims she stole valuable items before her arrest and must face Thalon's justice. Elaine's face hardened. I stole nothing. Of course not, Dorian said firmly. The accusation is merely a pretext. He turned to Garrick. What else does the message contain? Veiled threats, sire. Implications that harboring her could be considered an act hostile to peaceful relations. Dorian's jaw tightened. Bring the messenger to the small audience chamber. I'll hear him directly. As Garrick bowed and departed, Dorian turned back to Elaine. It seems our investigations have stirred the hornet's nest. Alarm flashed across her face. You won't send me back? Never, he replied without hesitation, the vehemence in his tone surprising them both. More measured, he added. You were released into my custody through formal diplomatic channels. Thalon has no legal claim to you now. Relief softened her features. Thank you. There's more we must discuss, Dorian said, already moving toward the door. But first I must deal with this messenger. Please continue your reading. This library is at your disposal, though perhaps avoid the windows for now. No need to give Thalon's man a glimpse of what he's come to reclaim. Elaine nodded, but as Dorian reached the door, she called after him. Your Majesty, if what you suggest about my heritage is true, what would it mean for me, for my future? Dorian paused, considering her question carefully. It would mean you have choices, Elaine, perhaps for the first time in your life. What those choices lead to, that would be for you to decide. Their eyes held for a moment longer before he departed, leaving her alone with ancient tomes and newer, more personal questions than any book could answer. The audience chamber was deliberately chosen for its intimate scale, a place for private discussions rather than formal court proceedings. When Dorian entered, Thalon's messenger was already waiting, a tall man with a scar across his left cheek and cold, assessing eyes. Your Majesty, the messenger bowed stiffly. I bring words from King Thalon of... I'm aware of who sent you, Dorian interrupted, taking his seat. And I've been informed of the general nature of your message. Now I would hear the specific terms. The messenger's lips thinned at the interruption, but he continued smoothly. King Thalon demands the return of the prisoner Elaine, who was removed from his jurisdiction under false pretenses. She is wanted for theft of royal property and espionage against the crown. Interesting, Dorian replied mildly. When I negotiated her release, the only crime mentioned was alleged espionage, with no evidence presented. Now theft has been added to her offenses. What exactly is she supposed to have stolen? A valuable heirloom of historical significance, the messenger stated. Its nature is confidential. Her mother's necklace, perhaps, Dorian suggested, watching the man's face carefully. A silver pendant with a crescent moon star and sword design. A flicker of surprise crossed the messenger's face before he controlled it. I am not privy to such details, Your Majesty. Of course not. Dorian leaned back. Well, you may inform King Thalen that the woman was legally released into my custody through proper diplomatic channels, in exchange for significant trade concessions. She will not be returned based on nebulous accusations that seem to multiply with each passing day. The messenger's posture stiffened. King Thalen anticipated your reluctance and instructed me to inform you that withholding her will be considered an act of aggression against Thalen. The consequences could include the suspension of all trade agreements and border permissions. Dorian's expression hardened, though his voice remained level. And you may inform King Thalen that threats against a sovereign ruler on his own soil could be considered equally aggressive. Harwald has honored its agreements for generations. It is Thalen who now seeks to renege on a settled diplomatic exchange. He stood, signaling the audience was nearing its end. I will consider King Thalen's request as a matter of courtesy between neighboring realms, but I will not be bullied into surrendering a woman who has committed no proven crime based on accusations that appear manufactured for convenience. The messenger bowed again, his face carefully blank. I will convey your words precisely, Your Majesty. See that you do. You will be provided suitable accommodations tonight. Your answer will be prepared by morning. After the messenger was escorted out, Dorian summoned his inner council for an emergency meeting. Over the next several hours, they debated strategies for addressing Thalen's increasingly hostile position without triggering open conflict. By evening, when Dorian finally returned to the library, he found Elaine still there, surrounded by open books and maps, her face intent with concentration. I see you've been busy, he observed, noting the organized stacks of volumes she had pulled from various shelves. She looked up, a new determination in her eyes. I've been researching House Varel. Everything I could find in your collection. She pushed forward a map that showed the eastern territories in detail. Their lands included 3 silver mines, 2 major trade routes, and access to the Silverflow River. No wonder Thalen's father wanted them eliminated. Dorian studied her with newfound respect. You've accomplished more in an afternoon than my historians might in a week. I had motivation, she replied simply, and I found something else. She carefully opened an older, dust-covered tome. This registry of noble births includes an entry for Alanis Virel, daughter of Lord Conrad and Lady Matilda, born in the summer of the 35th year of King Aldrich's reign. And later, she flipped forward several pages, a note of her marriage to Lord Rowan Vane of the Northern Shores. Her finger traced the entry. There's no record of children, but the registry ends shortly after that marriage, when the war began. Dorian exhaled slowly, processing the implications. Lord Rowan was reported killed in the first year of fighting. If Lady Alanis was with child when she fled. If, Elaine emphasized, though her voice wavered slightly, it's still just supposition, built on a matching necklace design and my mother's unusual mannerisms. There is one way to strengthen the connection, Dorian said carefully. Lady Marjorie mentioned your birthmark, the crescent shape. Elaine's hand moved unconsciously to her left shoulder. What of it? House Varel was known for a distinctive hereditary mark, a crescent moon birthmark on the left shoulder, said to appear in those of direct bloodline. He approached the table where she sat. I don't ask you to reveal anything that makes you uncomfortable, but such a mark would be compelling evidence. She studied his face for a long moment, weighing trust against decades of ingrained caution. Finally, she turned slightly and lowered the shoulder of her dress just enough to reveal a dark crescent shape at the juncture of her neck and shoulder, perfectly formed and unmistakable. I've had it since birth, she said quietly. My mother told me never to show it to anyone, that it was our secret. Dorian's breath caught. She was protecting you. From what? I never understood. Elaine readjusted her dress, her expression troubled. Until now, perhaps. As night fell over Harwald Castle, they remained in the library, piecing together fragments of a history long buried, but never truly forgotten. Outside, stars emerged in the darkening sky, including the 6-pointed star that had once adorned the banner of House Varel, now watching over its possible last heir as she reclaimed the knowledge of who she might truly be. Morning mist clung to Harwald's gardens as Elaine walked the stone paths, lost in thought. Sleep had eluded her after yesterday's revelations. her mind filled with fragments of memories that suddenly carried new meaning. Her mother's insistence on perfect posture, the way she corrected Elaine's speech, the mysterious late-night visitors who spoke in hushed tones. "You're up early, my lady." The voice startled her. She turned to find Lord Garrick approaching along the path, his formal attire suggesting he had already attended early council meetings. "I'm not a lady," she replied automatically, then hesitated. "At least I don't know with certainty that I am." Garrick's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were kind. "Uncertainty about one's place in the world is a heavy burden. I hope you don't bear it alone. His Majesty has been—" She searched for the right word. "Supportive. He sees something in you," Garrick remarked, falling into step beside her as they continued along the garden path. "In 20 years of service, I've rarely seen him so personally invested in a diplomatic matter." Elaine glanced at him, trying to discern his meaning. "Do you disapprove?" "My approval or disapproval is irrelevant," he replied diplomatically. "But I am concerned. Thalon's messenger left at dawn with King Dorian's refusal to return you. The consequences may be severe." "I never asked to become a point of contention between kingdoms," Elaine said, distress edging her voice. Garrick stopped, turning to face her directly. "Few of us choose the roles history assigns us, my lady. But how we play those roles, that remains our choice." He gave a small bow. "If you'll excuse me, the king has requested your presence in the East Tower once you've broken your fast. I believe he has matters of importance to discuss." As Garrick departed, Elaine remained in the garden, watching as the rising sun burned away the morning mist. If she truly was the last heir of House Varel, her existence threatened Thalon's claim to territories that had significantly expanded his kingdom's wealth and power. No wonder he had been so determined to keep her locked away. But what did that mean for her future, and for Harwald, now sheltering her against Thalon's demands? An hour later, after a brief meal she barely tasted, Elaine climbed the winding steps to the East Tower. At the top, she found an unexpected sight. Not the formal meeting she had anticipated, but King Dorian alone, bent over a large table covered with maps and documents, his crown nowhere in sight. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. He looked up at her entrance, a smile warming his features. "Ah, Elaine, thank you for coming." "Your Majesty," she curtsied, taking in the room. Circular, with bookshelves lining the walls and various astronomical instruments placed near the windows. "Lord Garrick said you wished to see me. Please join me." He gestured to the table. "And when we're speaking privately like this, you may call me Dorian. Titles create unnecessary distance." She approached cautiously, still uncomfortable with such familiarity. "What is all this?" "The complete history of the Eastern provinces, or as complete as my archives allow," he replied, indicating the spread of documents, including detailed maps of House Varel's former holdings. Elaine's eyes were drawn to a beautifully illustrated map showing a castle perched above a river valley, surrounded by forests and farmland. A banner bearing the crescent and star emblem flew from its highest tower. "Mooncliff Castle," Dorian explained, noting her interest. "The ancestral seat of House Varel. It was said to be built of silver-veined marble that caught the moonlight, making it glow on clear nights." "What happened to it?" she asked softly. "Officially, it was destroyed in the war, burned and abandoned." He pulled out another document. "But this report from a border patrol 3 years ago mentions ruins that are still partially intact. Thalon never rebuilt there, perhaps out of superstition, or perhaps because focusing attention on the site would raise uncomfortable questions about how its previous inhabitants met their end." Elaine traced the outline of the castle with her fingertip. "Why are you showing me this?" Dorian's expression grew more serious. "Because Thalon's reaction to your presence here confirms my suspicions. He fears you, Elaine, not because you stole something or spied on him, but because of who you might be." He straightened, meeting her eyes directly. "I had a messenger dispatched to the northern shores last night, seeking any records of Lord Rowan Vane and his marriage to Lady Olennis. If we can establish that connection conclusively—" "Then what?" Elaine interrupted, a rare flash of impatience breaking through her composed exterior. "What would it change?" The castle is in ruins, the lands are under Thalen's control, and I've spent 30 years as a servant. I can't simply transform into a noble lady because of birthright. Dorian observed her outburst with thoughtful patience. Your heritage wouldn't change who you are, Elaine, but it would change what's possible for you, and perhaps for the eastern provinces as well. She shook her head, moving away from the table to gaze out one of the tower windows. Below, the castle grounds bustled with normal activity, servants carrying linens, guards patrolling the walls, stable boys exercising horses in the yard. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been, she said quietly. I think you underestimate yourself, Dorian replied, coming to stand beside her at the window. The woman who survived Thalen's dungeon with her dignity intact, who taught herself history and geography from borrowed books, who carries herself with natural grace despite years of servitude, that woman has always been more than her circumstances allowed her to show. The sincerity in his voice made her turn to face him. Standing this close, she could see flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the slight silver threading his dark hair at the temples, the faint lines that responsibility had etched around his mouth. He was not classically handsome like the heroes in romantic ballads, but his face held something more compelling: character, intelligence, and a fundamental decency that radiated from within. You speak as though you have faith in me, she said softly. I do, he replied simply. Perhaps more than you have in yourself at present. Something shifted between them in that moment, a subtle change in the air, a new awareness that neither was prepared to acknowledge directly. Elaine broke eye contact first, returning her attention to the documents on the table. So what happens now? Now we wait for responses to my inquiries while protecting you from Thalen's machinations, Dorian answered, his tone becoming more businesslike. Which brings me to the second reason I asked you here. Given Thalen's aggressive posture, your safety may be at risk. I've arranged for additional guards to be assigned near your quarters, and I must ask that you not wander the grounds unaccompanied. You think he would try to take me by force? Elaine asked, alarmed. I think Thalen is desperate to eliminate any threat to his legitimacy, Dorian said grimly, and a living heir of House Varel would be precisely that. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lady Marjorie entered, her usually composed features tight with concern. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Merrick requests your immediate presence in the council chamber. A second messenger from Thalen has arrived with urgent demands. Dorian's expression darkened. Already? That was faster than expected. He turned to Elaine. Please remain here. Lady Marjorie will stay with you until I return. After he departed, the two women stood in awkward silence. Elaine could feel Lady Marjorie's curious gaze upon her, assessing and wondering. You served House Varel once, Elaine said finally, deciding directness was preferable to uncomfortable speculation. Did you know Lady Elenis? Surprise flickered across the older woman's face before she composed herself. I did, my lady. I was a lady's maid to her mother first, then to her when she came of age. What was she like? Elaine asked, unable to keep the yearning from her voice. Lady Marjorie's expression softened with memory. She was kind but strong-willed, beautiful, with golden hair much like yours. She loved music and could play the lute so sweetly it would bring tears to your eyes. But she had a mischievous streak too, always slipping away from her chaperones to ride alone in the forests or swim in the river. And her husband, Lord Rowan? A good match, Lady Marjorie replied, a hint of fondness in her tone. Handsome and brave, but gentle too. He adored her from the moment they met at the spring festival. Their wedding was the last great celebration before the war came. Elaine absorbed these details hungrily, trying to reconcile them with her fragmented childhood memories. Did they have any children? Lady Marjorie hesitated. Lady Elenis was with child when Lord Rowan rode to war. He never returned to see whether he had a son or daughter. She studied Elaine's face carefully. When House Varel fell, we all assumed the child was lost as well. Lady Elenis was supposedly killed when Thalen's forces burned the castle. But if she escaped, Elaine pressed, if she fled with her infant daughter and hid in a small village as a seamstress, Then she would have done everything in her power to protect that child from those who destroyed her family, Lady Marjorie concluded softly, including raising her without knowledge of her true identity. Their conversation was interrupted by Dorian's return. His face was grave as he entered the tower room. Thalon has escalated his demands, he announced without preamble. He now claims that harboring you constitutes an act of aggression against his sovereignty. He threatens to cut off all trade routes and has moved troops to our shared border. Elaine's hand flew to her mouth. Because of me? This is madness. Not madness, fear, Dorian corrected grimly. His reaction confirms what we suspected. He knows exactly who you are, Elaine, and what your existence means for his claim to the Eastern Territories. Then I should leave, she declared, straightening her shoulders. I'll go somewhere distant, where neither you nor Thalon need concern yourselves with me. Your kingdom shouldn't suffer for my sake. Dorian shook his head firmly. That would solve nothing. Thalon would hunt you to the ends of the earth, and Harwald would lose its honor by abandoning you to that fate. His voice softened. Besides, I gave my word to protect you. I don't break such promises lightly. The council is divided, Your Majesty, Lady Marjorie observed cautiously. I heard Lord Merrick arguing that the woman isn't worth a potential conflict. Lord Merrick is entitled to his opinion, Dorian replied, a steely edge entering his tone. But in this matter, mine is the only one that matters. I will not bow to Thalon's threats. He turned back to Elaine. However, we must act quickly to strengthen your position. The more evidence we gather of your identity, the more leverage we have in diplomatic channels. What do you propose? Elaine asked. I'm sending a small expedition to the ruins of Mooncliff Castle, he said decisively. There may be records or artifacts there that could further establish your connection to House Varel, and you will accompany them. Her eyes widened in surprise. Me? But you just said it wasn't safe for me to even walk the gardens alone. In Harwald, you're vulnerable to covert action by Thalon's agents, Dorian explained. But traveling in secret with trusted guards to a location Thalon believes abandoned, that may actually be safer. And no one else would recognize items of significance to your family as readily as you might. Lady Marjorie looked alarmed. Sire, the journey to the eastern provinces is not without danger, especially for a lady unaccustomed to travel. I'm hardly a delicate flower, Elaine interjected with unexpected firmness. I've endured Thalon's dungeon and years of servitude before that. A journey through the countryside won't break me. She turned to Dorian. When would we leave? Tonight, under cover of darkness, he replied. Captain Reynard will lead a small contingent of my most trusted guards. You'll travel as a merchant's party to avoid drawing attention. As preparations were made throughout the day, Elaine found herself caught between fear and a strange, growing excitement. The possibility of seeing her ancestral home, even in ruins, stirred something deep within her that felt like awakening after a long sleep. That evening, as she prepared to depart, Dorian came to her chambers. He carried a small wooden box, which he presented to her with unusual solemnity. For your journey, he said as she opened it. Inside lay a dagger in a leather sheath, its hilt inlaid with silver wire forming a familiar pattern, a crescent moon, star, and sword. It belonged to House Varel, Dorian explained. One of the few artifacts that found its way to Harwald's treasury after the war. I thought it should return to its rightful owner. Elaine lifted the dagger carefully, feeling the perfect balance of the weapon in her hand. I don't know how to use this, she admitted. Captain Reynard will teach you, Dorian replied, though I pray you'll never need the knowledge. As she secured the dagger at her waist, hidden beneath her cloak, Elaine felt a strange sense of coming full circle, as though by accepting this emblem of her possible heritage, she was taking the first step on a journey that had begun long before her birth. Thank you, she said softly, meeting Dorian's gaze. Not just for this, but for everything. Few kings would risk so much for a woman of uncertain origin. Perhaps it's not just for you, he admitted, his voice low. Thalon's father wronged many people when he seized those lands. Justice has been delayed for decades. Perhaps, through you, it might finally be served. Though his words were measured, Elaine sensed deeper currents beneath them. Personal feelings he kept carefully contained behind the mask of kingship. Before she could respond, Captain Reynard appeared at the door, announcing that all was ready for departure. As Elaine prepared to follow the captain, Dorian caught her hand briefly. "Come back safely," he said, the formal tone of a king giving way to something more personal. "Harwald will await your return." In the starlight, she thought she glimpsed something in his eyes that mirrored her own confused emotions. Concern, certainly, but also a warmth that had nothing to do with politics or ancient bloodlines. "I will," she promised, holding his gaze for a moment longer than propriety might dictate. Then she turned away, pulling up her hood as she followed Captain Reynard into the night, toward a past she had never known and a future she could not predict. The journey to the eastern provinces took 4 days. 4 days of dirt roads, forest paths, and cautious travel under the guise of merchant traders. Captain Reynard, a weathered soldier with silver-streaked auburn hair and vigilant eyes, led their small party with quiet efficiency. 2 guards posed as assistants, while Elaine played the role of the merchant's wife, her golden hair hidden beneath modest head coverings. "We're approaching the old boundary," Reynard announced on the 4th morning as they crested a hill overlooking a vast valley. Once, a checkpoint stood here marking the border between Thalen's kingdom and the territories of House Virel. Elaine gazed across the landscape, rolling hills covered with early summer wildflowers, forests of oak and ash, a ribbon of silver river winding through the valley floor. Something about the vista stirred a strange familiarity in her chest, though she had never consciously seen this place before. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "And rich," Reynard added, pointing toward distant mountains. "Silver mines in those hills, fertile soil in the valley, strategic river access. Easy to see why Thalen's father wanted these lands." They continued down the hill, following a road that had once been well-maintained but now showed signs of neglect, cracked stones, encroaching vegetation. As they traveled deeper into what had once been Virel territory, Elaine noticed other signs of decline. Abandoned villages, fields gone fallow, bridges in disrepair. "Thalen takes the wealth but returns little," Reynard observed, following her gaze to a crumbling wayside shrine. These lands were prosperous under House Virel's stewardship. Now they're merely a resource to be drained. By late afternoon they approached a dense forest that seemed somehow darker than the woods they had passed earlier. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their massive branches creating a canopy that admitted only dappled sunlight to the forest floor. "The Silverheart Woods," Reynard explained in hushed tones, "sacred to the old families of this region. Legend says the first lords of Virel made a pact with the forest spirits, promising protection in exchange for prosperity." One of the younger guards snorted. "Superstitious nonsense." "Perhaps," Reynard replied evenly. "But I've patrolled these borders for 20 years, and I've never met a local who would enter these woods after dark. Nor have I met any of Thalen's men willing to venture deep within, even at midday." They made camp at the forest's edge that night, planning to reach the ruins of Mooncliff Castle by the following afternoon. As darkness fell, Elaine sat beside the small, carefully shielded fire, running her fingers over the dagger Dorian had given her. The silver inlay caught the firelight, making the crescent moon and star emblem seem to shimmer with life. "You should learn to use that properly," Reynard said, settling beside her. "A blade is no good to its owner without training." Elaine glanced around at their small camp where the other guards were busy with evening tasks. "Here? Now?" Reynard shrugged. "No time like the present, and no place safer than away from curious eyes at court." For the next hour, as night deepened around them, Reynard taught her the basics: how to hold the dagger, how to stand, simple defensive moves. Elaine proved a quick study, her natural grace translating well to these new skills. "Not bad," Reynard commented as she successfully blocked his slow, deliberate attack for the 3rd time. "You have good instincts." "Or perhaps it's in my blood," she replied, surprising herself with the assertion. Reynard studied her face in the firelight. "You're beginning to believe it, aren't you? That you're truly Lady Virel's daughter?" Elaine sheathed the dagger, considering his question. I don't know what to believe. The evidence seems compelling, but it feels distant, like a story someone told me about another woman's life. I knew your mother, Reynard said quietly. If that's who she was. Elaine's head snapped up. You did? How? I was a young soldier in Harwald's army during the border wars. Lord Rowan's forces and ours fought together against Thalen's father. His weathered face softened with memory. Lady Elenis would sometimes visit the camps, bringing supplies and tending wounded. She was fearless, rode right through contested territory without escort more than once. Beautiful woman, kind to common soldiers, and she had your eyes exactly. Elaine absorbed this information in silence, trying to reconcile this brave, noble lady with the tired seamstress of her childhood memories. What happened to her? The official records say she died when Mooncliff fell. Reynard poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Nobody knows for certain. The attack came suddenly, after Lord Rowan had fallen in battle. Some said Lady Elenis escaped with loyal servants. Others claimed her body was found in the ruins. Thalen's father declared the entire line extinct and claimed the lands by right of conquest. He looked up at Elaine. But there were always rumors, whispers that an heir survived. Thalen's people hunted for years, searching villages, questioning anyone with connections to the old house. Which is why my mother, if she was Lady Elenis, would have hidden her identity, Elaine reasoned. And mine. Precisely. Reynard nodded. And why Thalen himself would be so desperate to keep you locked away once he discovered who you might be. Before dawn the next morning, they broke camp and continued their journey, now entering the Silverheart Woods. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No bird song, little wildlife, only the occasional rustle of leaves in a breeze that didn't reach the forest floor. Massive, gnarled roots created natural barriers across the old road, forcing them to lead their horses carefully around obstacles. The forest doesn't welcome strangers, Reynard murmured as one of the horses balked at crossing a shallow stream that cut across their path. By midday, the trees began to thin, and suddenly they emerged onto a wide plateau overlooking a river valley. Elaine gasped at the sight before them. Mooncliff Castle stood on a natural promontory of white stone that gleamed silver in the sunlight. Though partially ruined, its highest tower collapsed, sections of wall blackened by old fire. It retained a haunting majesty. The main structure was built of the same white stone as the cliff, making it appear as if the castle had organically grown from the living rock. A waterfall cascaded beside it, feeding into the river below. It's still beautiful, Elaine whispered, unexpected tears stinging her eyes. They approached cautiously, alert for any sign that others might be watching the ruins. But the castle appeared long abandoned. Wildflowers grew between the courtyard stones, and saplings had taken root in what had once been the great hall. Thalen's men rarely patrol here, Reynard explained as they secured their horses in a stable that had partially survived the destruction. They're superstitious about the place, claim to hear voices on the wind at night. Inside, the castle was a strange mixture of ruin and preservation. Areas exposed to the elements had weathered badly, but interior rooms protected from rain and snow still contained furniture, tapestries, even books, all covered in decades of dust but otherwise intact. It's as if everyone simply vanished, Elaine observed, running her fingers over an ornate writing desk in what appeared to be a lady's solar. Dried flowers still stood in a vase, now crumbled to dust at her touch. The attack came at night, Reynard said grimly. From what I heard, few had time to flee with possessions. For hours they searched the castle methodically, looking for anything that might conclusively connect Elaine to House Virel. In the remains of the castle archives, they found ledgers, correspondence, and family records, but many had been damaged by fire or decay. As afternoon waned, Elaine felt a growing sense of disappointment. While they had gathered potentially valuable documents about the house's history and holdings, they had found nothing that specifically mentioned Lady Elenis's child or confirmed the fate of the lady herself. Perhaps we should camp here tonight and continue searching tomorrow, Reynard suggested, noting her frustration. There are still chambers we haven't explored. Elaine nodded absently, her attention caught by something across the room. A tapestry hanging askew on the wall, its bottom edge singed but the upper portion remarkably preserved. It depicted a family tree, the branches embroidered with names and small portraits. At the bottom corner stood two figures, a man and woman in formal attire, holding hands beneath a crescent moon. Even through decades of dust and smoke damage, the woman's golden hair and blue eyes were unmistakable.
"Reynard,"
Elaine called, her voice unsteady.
"help me take this down."
Together, they carefully removed the heavy tapestry from its hangings. As it came away from the wall, Elaine noticed something unusual, a slight unevenness in the stone behind it. Pressing her fingers against the wall, she felt one stone shift slightly. "There's something here," she murmured, pushing harder until the stone moved inward with a grinding sound. Behind it was a small cavity containing a metal box, tarnished with age but intact. With trembling hands, Elaine removed it and set it on a nearby table. "The seal of House Virel," Reynard observed, pointing to the emblem stamped into the metal lid. Inside the box, they found several items: a journal bound in blue leather, a small portrait in a silver frame showing the same couple from the tapestry, a sealed letter, and a silver ring bearing the house crest. Elaine opened the journal carefully, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine. Entries by Lady Elenis herself, dating from just before the war through the early days of the conflict. With growing excitement, Elaine turned the pages until she reached an entry that made her breath catch. "The 3rd day of summer, in the 43rd year of King Aldric's reign, Rowan has been gone these 3 months, and each day brings more troubling news from the front. I fear for him constantly, but must remain strong, especially now. The physician confirmed today what I had suspected. I am with child, our child, a new heir for House Virel, to be born when winter gives way to spring. I pray daily that Rowan will return safely to meet his son or daughter." "This confirms Lady Elenis was expecting a child," Elaine said softly, "but not what happened to either of them." She continued turning pages, following Lady Elenis's increasingly anxious entries as the war intensified, and news came of Lord Rowan's death in battle. The final entries were hurried, the handwriting less controlled. "Word has come that Thalen's forces march on Mooncliff. They say he means to leave no Virel alive to contest his claim to our lands. I can no longer stay. Faithful Brenna and Thomas will escort me to the northern villages where we might pass unrecognized. May the gods forgive me for abandoning our ancestral home, but I must protect the child. Rowan's child. The last hope of House Virel." With hands that now shook visibly, Elaine broke the seal on the letter. Unlike the journal, this was written on fine parchment and addressed formally. To be opened by the heir of House Virel upon their return to Mooncliff. The message inside was brief but devastating in its implications. "To my beloved child, if you are reading this, then you have discovered your true heritage despite all efforts to conceal it for your protection. Know that you were born of love between myself and your father, Lord Rowan Vane, rightful defenders of these lands. Whatever name you now bear, whatever life you have lived, you are the last of our line, the rightful heir to Mooncliff and all the territories of House Virel. I cannot know what world you have grown into or what dangers still exist, but I leave this record and the ring of our house in hope that someday justice will return to these lands." Elaine stared at the letter, emotions warring within her, shock, grief, validation. The ring sat heavy in her palm, its weight both physical and symbolic. "She knew she might never see me grow up," Elaine whispered. She prepared this for a future she couldn't be certain would ever come. Reynard rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She was protecting you until the end, and beyond." A noise from outside interrupted the moment, the distant sound of voices and horses approaching. Reynard moved quickly to the window, his expression darkening. Riders coming up the path, at least a dozen, bearing Thalen's standard. He turned to Elaine, suddenly all soldier again. "Gather everything. We need to leave, now." As they hastily collected the documents and box, Elaine asked, "How did they know we were here?" "Someone must have betrayed our mission," Reynard replied grimly. "The question is who, and whether they sent word to Thalon before or after we left Harwald." They fled through the castle's back passages, Reynard leading them to a servant's exit that opened onto a narrow trail down the cliff face. As they scrambled down toward the river, shouts echoed from above. Thalan's men had entered the castle and discovered signs of their recent presence. "We can't outrun mounted soldiers," one of the younger guards said, panic edging his voice. "We don't need to outrun them," Reynard replied calmly. "We just need to reach the Silverheart Woods. Even Thalan's men won't follow us deep into the forest after nightfall." As darkness gathered around them, they pushed through increasingly dense underbrush, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant behind them. Elaine clutched the metal box to her chest, its contents now infinitely precious to her, proof of her identity, her heritage, and her mother's love across decades of separation. When they finally stopped to rest in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks whose massive roots created natural shelters, Elaine slipped the Varel signet ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if made for her hand. "What now?" she asked Reynard softly. "Now we return to Harwald by a different route," he replied. "With the evidence, King Dorian needs to legitimize your claim and challenge Thalan's hold on these lands." Elaine gazed up at the stars visible through breaks in the canopy overhead, the same stars that had shone down on her mother as she fled this very forest with an unborn child, desperate to protect the future of her house. She would never have imagined this, Elaine murmured, that her daughter would return as a servant, not a noble lady. "Blood tells, my lady," Reynard replied, the title coming naturally now. "The woman who survived Thalan's dungeon with dignity and tact, who learned to wield a dagger in a single evening, who remained calm when facing armed pursuit. That woman is every inch of Varel, regardless of how she was raised." As they settled in for a few hours' rest before continuing their journey under cover of darkness, Elaine felt something shift within her, acceptance of a truth that had been building since her first conversation with Dorian in the library. She was Elaine of House Varel, rightful heir to these lands, and for the first time since discovering her possible heritage, she allowed herself to wonder not just what that meant for the past, but what it might mean for her future, and for her growing feelings toward a certain king who had seen her value when she was nothing more than a prisoner in a forgotten cell. Rain lashed against the windows of Harwald Castle, matching the grim mood that had settled over the royal residence in the 6 days since Elaine's departure. King Dorian stood at the window of his study, watching water cascade down the glass while thunder rumbled in the distance. Behind him, Lord Garrick cleared his throat discreetly. "The council is assembled, Your Majesty. They await your response to Thalan's latest message." Dorian's reflection in the window revealed the strain of sleepless nights. "Tell them I will join them shortly." When Garrick hesitated instead of leaving, Dorian turned. "What is it?" "There's still no word from Captain Reynard's party," Garrick said carefully. "Some on the council are suggesting we must assume the worst." "The worst?" Dorian's voice sharpened. "You mean that Thalan's men found them? Or that they simply haven't returned quickly enough to satisfy Lord Merrick's impatience?" Garrick winced at the uncharacteristic edge in his king's tone. "Both concerns have been raised, sire. It's been 6 days, and the journey should have taken no more than 5, even accounting for cautious travel." Dorian rubbed his temples, where a headache had been building since dawn. "Captain Reynard is my most experienced border officer. If they've been delayed, he will have good reason." He straightened his shoulders, composing himself. "Tell the council I'll be there directly, and send Lady Marjorie to me first." After Garrick departed, Dorian crossed to his desk, where maps of the eastern territories lay spread beside the latest threatening message from Thalan. The parchment bore the royal seal of their neighboring kingdom, but the words were anything but diplomatic. "To King Dorian of Harwald, your harboring of criminals and your interference in Thalan's internal affairs constitute acts of aggression that cannot be ignored. Your recent clandestine activities in our territories further demonstrate hostile intent. Return the prisoner Elaine immediately, withdraw all agents from our lands, and provide compensation for these insults, or face the severance of all diplomatic relations and the closure of trade routes effective immediately." The door opened quietly as Lady Marjorie entered, curtsying briefly. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" "Yes." Dorian gestured to a chair. You've served this castle longer than anyone, Marjorie. I value your discretion and your insight. The older woman sat, her posture as precise as always, but her eyes concerned. Something troubles you beyond the obvious tensions with Thalen. Indeed. Dorian leaned against his desk, arms crossed. This morning, I discovered certain documents missing from the royal archives. Documents pertaining to House Varel and its territories. Documents that were restricted to council members and myself. Lady Marjorie's eyes widened slightly. Stolen, Your Majesty. Or copied and reported upon, Dorian said grimly. Which would explain how Thalen knew exactly where to send men looking for our expedition. Understanding dawned on Lady Marjorie's face. You believe there's a traitor in the council? Or among the castle staff with access to restricted areas? Dorian's expression hardened. I need your eyes and ears, Marjorie. Who has been acting unusually? Who has been asking questions about Elaine? Who might have reasons to curry favor with Thalen? Lady Marjorie considered carefully before responding. Lord Merrick has opposed your protection of the lady from the beginning, and he has trade interests that would suffer greatly if relations with Thalen deteriorated. She hesitated before adding, I've also noticed him meeting frequently with that new undersecretary, the one who manages the archive registry. Edmund Brooks, Dorian supplied, his mind working quickly. He was recommended by Lord Merrick 6 months ago. Indeed, and he's been seen working late hours when the archives should be closed. She met Dorian's gaze directly. But sire, these are serious suspicions about a council member who has served the crown for decades. Desperate times make formerly loyal men consider desperate measures, Dorian replied. Have Brooks watched discreetly. As for Lord Merrick, he paused, considering. For now, we'll feed him false information and see where it leads. A sharp knock interrupted them, followed immediately by the door bursting open. A guard stood there, breathing heavily. Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, but riders approach from the East Road. Captain Reynard's party has returned. Dorian moved swiftly past the guard, all protocol forgotten in his haste. He strode through corridors and down staircases, emerging into the rain-soaked courtyard just as the bedraggled travelers rode through the main gate. Captain Reynard dismounted first, his cloak heavy with rainwater, his face haggard with exhaustion. Behind him, Elaine slid carefully from her horse, one hand clutching a metal box to her chest, the other steadying herself against the saddle. Her traveling clothes were mud-spattered and torn in places, her hair darkened by rain and tied back in a simple braid, yet she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Dorian resisted the urge to rush forward, maintaining royal decorum despite the relief flooding through him. Captain Reynard, Lady Elaine, he acknowledged them formally, aware of the many eyes watching from windows and doorways. Welcome back to Harwald. Your Majesty. Reynard bowed stiffly, his movements suggesting injury or extreme fatigue. We bring important discoveries from Mooncliff Castle, and news that Thalen's men are actively patrolling those territories with orders to capture Lady Varel at any cost. Dorian noted the change in how Reynard addressed Elaine, no longer simply by her first name, but with the title of her house. His eyes moved to her, taking in her exhausted but determined expression. We have much to discuss, he said, gesturing toward the castle entrance. But first, dry clothes and hot food for all of you. As they moved inside, Dorian fell into step beside Elaine. You're injured, he observed quietly, noting how she favored her right leg. A minor fall during our hasty departure, she replied with a small smile. Captain Reynard insisted on binding it properly, though it slowed our return journey. I'm grateful for his caution, Dorian said, and more relieved by your safe return than I can properly express in this setting. Her eyes met his briefly, something unspoken passing between them. As am I, Your Majesty. They parted in the great hall, Elaine going with Lady Marjorie to change into dry clothes, while Reynard accompanied Dorian to his private study. Once there, the captain gave a detailed account of their journey, the discovery of Lady Elenis's journal and letter, and their narrow escape from Thalen's soldiers. So it's confirmed, Dorian said when Reynard finished. She is indeed the daughter of Lady Elenis and Lord Rowan. Without question, sire, Reynard affirmed. The journal documents Lady Elenis's pregnancy, her escape with loyal servants, and her intent to hide in the northern villages, precisely where Elaine recalls growing up. The letter was addressed to her heir, along with the Varel signet ring, which she now wears. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. But there's something else, Your Majesty. Something we discovered on our return journey that may explain Thalan's particular interest in keeping her identity secret. Before Reynard could elaborate, another knock came at the door. Lady Marjorie entered with Elaine, now dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue. Her hair had been dried and arranged more carefully, and she carried herself with newfound confidence, the Varel signet ring visible on her right hand. Dorian rose automatically at her entrance, struck by the transformation. It wasn't merely the clothing or the grooming. Something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor, as if accepting her heritage had unlocked a part of herself long suppressed. Lady Varel, he greeted her, the title feeling both strange and right on his tongue. Your Majesty, she replied with a perfect curtsy. I believe we have much to discuss. Over the next hour, Elaine shared her discoveries, occasionally opening the metal box to show him the journal entries, the letter, and the portrait of her parents. Dorian listened intently, asking occasional questions, but mostly allowing her to tell the story in her own words. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, processing the implications. This evidence, combined with the birthmark and your physical resemblance to Lady Elenis, creates an irrefutable claim to your heritage. You are, without doubt, the rightful heir to House Varel and its territories. Territories currently held by Thalon, she pointed out, who clearly knows exactly who I am and has gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent this truth from emerging. Which brings us to the matter I was about to share, Captain Reynard interjected. While avoiding Thalon's patrols on our return journey, we traveled through several villages in what was once Varel land. The people there speak of Thalon with hatred, not merely the usual resentment subjects might feel toward a stern ruler, but genuine loathing. They say he takes their silver, their crops, their very children for his armies, and returns nothing. Such complaints might be expected under harsh rule, Dorian observed, but hardly explain his extreme reaction to Elaine's existence. There's more, Reynard continued. In the village of Ashenford, we met an old man, a former steward of Mooncliff Castle who survived the attack. He told us that Thalon's father didn't merely seize House Varel's lands after the war. The attack came weeks after formal peace had been declared, when Lord Rowan was already dead and no threat remained. Elaine leaned forward, her eyes intense. It wasn't conquest, it was calculated murder to seize our lands under the cover of war's chaos. And the people know this truth, even if official records were altered to hide it. Which means, Dorian concluded grimly, that Thalon's entire claim to those territories rests on a foundation of lies and illegitimate bloodshed. No wonder he feared your discovery. Your very existence threatens not just his hold on the Varel lands, but potentially his entire legitimacy as king. A heavy silence fell over the room as they all considered the ramifications. Finally, Lady Marjorie spoke from where she had been quietly listening. Your Majesty, while this discovery is momentous, we must also consider the immediate danger. Lord Merrick and the Secretary Brooks. What about Lord Merrick? Elaine interrupted, her body tensing. Dorian quickly explained his suspicions about information being leaked to Thalon, watching her face carefully as understanding dawned. That explains how they found us at Mooncliff so quickly, she said. We had barely begun our search when Thalon's men arrived. And it means you remain in danger here, Dorian added grimly. If there is indeed a traitor within these walls, your safety cannot be guaranteed until we identify them. Elaine's chin lifted slightly. I've faced Thalon's dungeon once already. I won't cower in fear now that I know who I truly am. Something in her quiet determination stirred Dorian's admiration anew. Before he could respond, another interruption came, this time a servant bearing a sealed message that had just arrived by special courier. Dorian broke the unfamiliar seal and scanned the contents, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he handed the parchment to Garrick without comment. What is it? Elaine asked, tension evident in her voice. A message from Lord Emeron, Dorian replied. A former magistrate of Thalan's court who fled into exile decades ago. I sent inquiries to him about House Varel shortly after you arrived at Harwald. And, she pressed when he didn't immediately continue, and he confirms everything we've discovered, and more. Dorian ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. He witnessed Thalan's father give the order to eliminate House Varel after the peace treaty was signed. He possesses documents proving the attack was planned specifically to seize the silver mines and river access, and he's willing to travel to Harwald to testify to these facts before representatives of the neighboring kingdoms. This could change everything, Reynard breathed. With such testimony and Lady Elaine's confirmed identity, Thalan's claim to those territories could be invalidated under the ancient laws of succession, recognized by all the realm's kingdoms. It could also start a war, Garrick cautioned, setting down the letter. Thalan will not surrender those lands peacefully, regardless of legal rulings. Then what options remain? Elaine asked, looking directly at Dorian. I have no army to reclaim my birthright. While I may be Lady Varel by blood, I have no practical power to challenge Thalan's hold on my family's lands. Not alone, Dorian agreed, meeting her gaze steadily. But Harwald does, and with proper diplomatic preparation, we could gain the support of other kingdoms who have long resented Thalan's aggressive expansionism. You would risk war for my claim? Elaine asked incredulously, after counseling me about the dangers of challenging Thalan too directly. Not for your claim alone, Dorian replied carefully, but for justice long denied, for the truth about crimes committed under the guise of legitimate warfare, and for the people of those territories who have suffered under Thalan's harsh rule. He paused before adding softly, though I won't pretend your welfare hasn't become a matter of personal concern to me as well. Color rose in Elaine's cheeks at this near admission of feelings that had been building between them. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Raised voices, hurried footsteps. The door burst open to reveal Lord Merrick, his face flushed with indignation, flanked by 2 council members. Your Majesty, he began without preamble, I must protest this secret council you're conducting while ignoring the formal meeting that has been waiting for over an hour. And with this, he gestured dismissively toward Elaine, this person whose very presence has brought Thalan's wrath upon us. Dorian rose slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. You forget yourself, Lord Merrick. You enter my private study without permission and speak disrespectfully of Lady Varel, rightful heir of Mooncliff. Merrick scoffed. Lady Varel? So you've accepted this servant's wild claims without proper investigation? The council will not support such reckless... The council, Dorian interrupted coldly, serves at my pleasure, Lord Merrick, as do you, and you would do well to remember that before questioning decisions you know nothing about. Tension crackled in the air between them. Merrick's eyes darted briefly to the metal box on the table and the document spread beside it. Something calculating entered his expression. Of course, Your Majesty, he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. I spoke hastily, out of concern for the kingdom's stability. Perhaps if I were better informed about the evidence supporting the lady's claims, I could help persuade the council of their validity. Dorian studied the older man carefully, noting the too eager shift in demeanor. Indeed, you shall have full details when I address the council, which I will do shortly. For now, I require privacy to conclude this discussion. After Merrick reluctantly withdrew, Dorian turned to Garrick. Have him watched, and secure those documents Brooks has been accessing. I want both men closely monitored, but given the impression they still move freely. You believe Lord Merrick is the traitor, Elaine observed once Garrick had departed on this mission. I believe gold and fear can corrupt even long-standing loyalty, Dorian replied. And Merrick has significant investments that depend on Thalan's goodwill. He turned to her, his expression grave. But now we must decide our next move carefully. Thalan knows you've returned with evidence of your identity. Whatever he plans will come swiftly. Elaine stood, drawing herself up with quiet dignity. The Varel signet ring caught the light as she placed her hand over the metal box containing her mother's last message to her. Then we must be swifter, she said with sudden determination. I've spent my life hiding from a truth I didn't even know existed. I won't spend another day shrinking from who I am or the responsibility that comes with it. She met Dorian's gaze directly. Whatever course you choose, Your Majesty, know that Elaine of House Varel stands ready to face the consequences and to fight for what is rightfully hers. In that moment, watching her transformation from frightened prisoner to determined noblewoman, Dorian realized that the growing warmth he felt toward her had blossomed into something far deeper and more dangerous for a king to feel toward a woman whose very existence threatened the delicate balance of power between kingdoms. Dawn broke over Harwold with tentative fingers of light that found Elaine already awake, standing at her chamber window. Sleep had proven elusive after yesterday's confrontation with Lord Merrick and the subsequent council meeting where Dorian had formally presented the evidence of her heritage. The council's reaction had been mixed, some members expressing support for her claim, others voicing concern about challenging Thalen so directly, and a few, led by Lord Merrick, suggesting the evidence remained insufficient. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, turning from the window. Lady Marjorie came in carrying a covered tray. "You should eat, my lady. The day ahead may be demanding." Elaine smiled at the older woman who had become something of a confidant over the past weeks. "I find my appetite lacking this morning, but I appreciate your concern." Setting down the tray, Lady Marjorie studied Elaine's face. "You look like her, you know. Not just in coloring, but in spirit. That same thoughtful determination Lady Elenis showed when facing difficult choices." "You speak as if you knew her well," Elaine observed, sitting at the small table where Marjorie had placed the breakfast. "As well as a lady's maid might know her mistress," Marjorie replied, pouring tea with practiced grace. "I served House Varel for nearly 20 years before the fall. I was with your mother through her courtship with Lord Rowan, their wedding, the early days of the war." She hesitated before adding softly, "I would have accompanied her when she fled, but she insisted I would draw too much attention. My noble accent and mannerisms," she said, "would give us away." Elaine's hands stilled around her teacup. "You never mentioned this before. His Majesty asked me to be circumspect until your identity was confirmed." Marjorie sat across from Elaine, her usual formality softening slightly. "I wasn't certain at first, despite the resemblance. But when Captain Reynard returned with that journal and the ring, there could be no doubt." "What was she like?" Elaine asked, the question she had been longing to ask someone who truly knew Elenis, not just as a historical figure or through the filter of a child's memories. Not as Lady Varel, but as herself. Marjorie's eyes grew distant with memory. Willful, clever, kind to those who served her, but utterly unbending when she believed herself right. She played the lute beautifully and had a weakness for cherry tarts. A smile touched the older woman's lips. She used to sneak out of formal dinners to read in the castle library when conversations bored her. Your father would cover for her absence, claiming she had a headache, then join her there later with wine and sweetmeats smuggled from the kitchen. Each detail was a precious gift, filling in the outline of the woman Elaine had known only briefly and inadequately as a child. "They loved each other?" "Deeply," Marjorie confirmed. "Theirs wasn't an arranged match, though both families approved. They met at the Spring Festival in Harwold. Lord Rowan was attending as part of King Dorian's father's delegation. Lady Elenis was supposed to dance with a duke from the southern provinces, but she slipped away to the gardens instead. Lord Rowan found her there, hiding behind a hedge with a book." Elaine smiled at the image. "And when I was born? What happened after she fled Mooncliff?" Marjorie's expression sobered. "That I cannot tell you with certainty. After the castle fell, those of us who survived scattered. I eventually made my way to Harwold, where Queen Eleanor, King Dorian's mother, remembered me from court functions and offered me a position. I heard rumors that Lady Elenis had escaped north, but nothing concrete until—" She gestured toward Elaine. "Until you arrived, carrying her face and spirit back into these halls." A more urgent knock interrupted them. Captain Reynard entered, his expression serious. "Forgive the intrusion, Lady Varel, but His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the East Tower. Lord Emeran has arrived, and he brings troubling news." Elaine rose quickly, her breakfast forgotten. Has something happened? It's best if His Majesty explains, Reynard replied, his tone revealing nothing. Minutes later, Elaine climbed the spiral staircase to the East Tower, where she found Dorian in conversation with an elderly man whose stooped posture belied the sharp intelligence in his eyes. Despite his advanced age and the simple traveling clothes he wore, there was an unmistakable dignity in his bearing that spoke of noble birth and high office. "Lady Varel," Dorian greeted her, his formal tone not quite masking the warmth in his eyes. "May I present Lord Emerin, former High Magistrate of Thalen's court." "My lady." Emerin bowed carefully, his movement stiff with age. "I can scarcely believe my eyes. You are the very image of your mother." "You knew her?" Elaine asked, coming forward to take the old man's hands in greeting. "I had that honor, yes. I presided over her marriage to Lord Rowan." His rheumy eyes studied her face intently. "The resemblance is remarkable. Thalon must have been terrified when he realized who you were." "That's precisely what we need to discuss," Dorian said, gesturing for them to be seated near the fire that warded off the early morning chill. "Lord Emerin has brought information that changes our understanding of Thalon's actions toward you." Once they were settled, the elderly magistrate withdrew a leather portfolio from his traveling case. "I've spent decades collecting evidence of Thalon's crimes, both his own and those of his father. It began as a matter of conscience, but became something more when I realized the extent of their deceptions." He removed several documents, spreading them carefully on the table between them. "This is a copy of the official peace treaty ending the border wars, signed by all participating kingdoms, including Thalon's father. Note the date." He pointed with a gnarled finger. "And this is a military dispatch ordering the attack on Mooncliff Castle. The date is 3 weeks later, well after peace was officially declared." Dorian leaned forward, studying the documents. "This confirms what we suspected. The attack was not an act of war, but a calculated seizure of lands while the other kingdoms were too exhausted from fighting to intervene." "Indeed," Emerin nodded. "But there's more. This third document is the most damning, and explains Thalon's particular interest in Lady Elenis and her potential heir. The parchment he indicated was older, its edges frayed, but the elegant script still clearly legible." "What is this?" Elaine asked, unable to decipher the formal legal language. "A marriage contract," Emerin explained, "between Lady Elenis's grandfather and the Princess of the Northern Shores. The dowry included a formal decree establishing that the silver mines and river access of Varel lands would forever remain under the sole control of House Varel and its direct descendants, regardless of which kingdom claimed nominal sovereignty over the region." Understanding dawned on Dorian's face. So, even if Thalon controlled the territories through conquest, he had no legal right to the mines or river trade without Varel consent. "Precisely," Emerin confirmed. "The decree was ratified by all neighboring kingdoms, including Thalon's grandfather. It's still legally binding, which means that Thalon has been illegally extracting wealth from those lands for decades," Elaine finished, stunned by the implications. "And as the last Varel, I could challenge not just his territorial control, but demand reparations for years of unlawful exploitation." "Now you understand why he was so desperate to keep you imprisoned," Emerin said grimly. "Or worse. It wasn't merely about territorial claims. It was about the immense wealth he would lose if your existence became known." A heavy silence fell over the room as they all absorbed this revelation. Finally, Dorian spoke. "This changes our approach considerably. We're no longer simply advocating for Lady Varel's territorial rights. We're exposing a decades-long criminal enterprise that has drained wealth from lands protected by international treaty, which makes Thalon even more dangerous," Reynard observed from his position near the door. "He won't surrender those resources without a fight." "He may not have a choice," Emerin countered. "I've maintained connections with magistrates in all the neighboring kingdoms. Once these documents are presented at a formal conclave, even Thalon's allies will be hard-pressed to support his illegal claims." Elaine rose, pacing toward the window. The morning sun now fully illuminated Harwald's gardens below, where servants went about their duties in peaceful ignorance of the political earthquake brewing above. "This knowledge gives us leverage," she said slowly, "but also increases the danger. Thalon clearly knew about these legal restrictions. It's why his father targeted House Varel so specifically. He'll do anything to prevent these documents from becoming public. Which is why we must move quickly, Dorian agreed, standing to join her at the window. Lord Emerin, how soon can the magistrates' conclave be convened? I've already sent messages. Given the gravity of the matter, they could assemble within a fortnight at the neutral ground of the Temple of Justice in High Pass. 2 weeks, Dorian mused. Time enough for Thalon to act if he learns of our intentions. He turned to Reynard. Double the guards on Lord Merrick and Brooks. If they are indeed Thalon's agents, we cannot risk them communicating this development. And what of me? Elaine asked quietly. What is my role in this process? Dorian's expression softened as he looked at her. You are central to everything, Lady Varel. Your testimony, combined with these documents and your physical proof of heritage, will be the foundation of the case against Thalon's claims. I meant, she clarified, her voice steady despite the flush rising to her cheeks. What am I to do in the interim? Hide away in chambers while others arrange my future? A smile touched Dorian's lips. I would never suggest something so contrary to your nature. In fact, I was hoping you would help prepare our presentation to the conclave. Your intimate knowledge of both Thalon's court and your ancestral lands provides perspective no one else can offer. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. I would be honored to contribute. Lord Emerin watched this exchange with knowing eyes. If I may, Your Majesty, Lady Varel should also begin taking a more public role in court life. If her claim is to be taken seriously by the magistrates, they must see her not as a former servant, but as a woman capable of assuming her noble responsibilities. I agree, Dorian nodded, which is why I intend to formally present Lady Varel to the court at tonight's dinner. It's time Harwald, and eventually all the kingdoms, recognize the last heir of House Varel. As preparations for the evening began, Elaine found herself swept into a flurry of activity she could scarcely have imagined weeks ago when she languished in Thalon's dungeon. Lady Marjorie supervised the creation of a proper gown befitting her station, while other attendants, formerly her fellow servants, now addressed her as "my lady," with varying degrees of awkwardness. By late afternoon, standing before a mirror in chambers that seemed too grand for someone who had spent most of her life making beds rather than sleeping in them, Elaine hardly recognized herself. The woman reflected back wore a gown of deep blue velvet with silver embroidery echoing the Varel crest at the bodice. Her golden hair had been arranged in an elegant style more suited to a noble lady than a castle servant, and around her neck hung a silver pendant, not her mother's lost necklace, but a new one Dorian had commissioned bearing the crescent and star emblem of her house. You look every inch a lady, Lady Marjorie said softly, adjusting the pendant. Your mother would be proud. Would she? Elaine questioned, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. I know nothing of court protocols or noble responsibilities. I can't even dance properly. Such things can be learned, came a deep voice from the doorway. Elaine turned to find Dorian standing there, resplendent in formal attire, the crown of Harwald resting on his dark hair. Lady Marjorie curtsied deeply and discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone. Your Majesty, Elaine acknowledged him, dropping into a curtsy that still betrayed her lack of formal training. You look beautiful, he said simply, crossing the room to stand before her. Though I suspect you're feeling rather overwhelmed. Is it that obvious? She asked with a small nervous laugh. Only to someone who has watched you face Thalon's threats and the discovery of your heritage with remarkable composure, he replied. This, he gestured to her formal attire, is merely the external trappings of nobility, the inner qualities that truly define it. Courage, dignity, compassion, those you already possess in abundance. His words eased something tight within her chest. I fear disappointing you. After all you've risked to support my claim. Stop, he interrupted gently. I didn't bring you from Thalon's dungeon, investigate your heritage, or support your claim for my own glorification, Elaine. I did it because it was right, because justice demanded it. He paused, something more personal entering his tone. And because I saw something in you from our first meeting that had nothing to do with bloodlines or territorial claims. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Elaine found herself acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth in his eyes that belied the formal distance his position required. "What happens after the conclave?" she asked softly. "If they rule in my favor and acknowledge my claim to the Varel lands, what then?" "That will be for you to decide," Dorian replied. "You would have options that were unimaginable weeks ago. Restoration to your ancestral lands, diplomatic alliances through marriage, perhaps even negotiated integration of your territories with a neighboring kingdom whose ruler you found compatible." The slight emphasis on the last word hung in the air between them, laden with possibility. Before she could respond, a bell chimed somewhere in the castle, signaling the imminent start of the evening's formal dinner. "It seems our time for private conversation has ended," Dorian said, straightening slightly. "But perhaps we might continue it later." He offered his arm. "For now, Lady Varel, would you allow me the honor of escorting you to your first court appearance?" Taking his arm, Elaine felt a curious mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with political dangers and personal challenges. Yet for the first time in her life, she was walking it not as someone defined by service to others, but as a woman claiming her own identity and perhaps, though she scarcely dared acknowledge it even to herself, her own heart. Candlelight bathed Harwald's great hall in golden warmth as nobles and dignitaries gathered for the formal dinner. Conversation hummed through the vaulted space, punctuated by occasional laughter and the delicate chime of crystal goblets. At the entrance, the master of ceremonies struck his staff against the marble floor 3 times, bringing immediate silence. "His Majesty, King Dorian of Harwald," he announced, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the hall, "and Lady Elaine of House Varel, rightful heir to the territories of Mooncliff." All eyes turned as Dorian entered with Elaine on his arm. He felt her tense slightly beside him and gave her hand a reassuring pressure where it rested on his forearm. "Breathe," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "You belong here as much as any of them." The assembled court bowed or curtsied as they passed, but Elaine could feel their scrutiny, the measured assessment in their gazes, the barely concealed whispers behind jeweled hands. Near the center of the room, Lord Merrick stood with several council members, his face a careful mask of neutrality that didn't quite hide the calculation in his eyes. "Your Majesty," he greeted as they approached. "Lady Varel." The title fell from his lips with just enough emphasis to suggest doubt. "What a remarkable transformation. One would hardly guess your humble beginnings." "Thank you, Lord Merrick," Elaine replied smoothly, finding strength in Dorian's steady presence beside her. "Though I find that true nobility has little to do with where one begins in life, and far more to do with how one conducts oneself in positions of influence and trust." Dorian's lips twitched slightly at the subtle rebuke. "Well said, my lady. Now, if you'll excuse us, other guests await our greeting." As they continued through the hall, Elaine whispered, "Was that too pointed?" "It was perfectly judged," Dorian replied, unable to hide his admiration. "Merrick underestimates you, a mistake I suspect many will make only once." They moved among the guests, Dorian introducing Elaine to nobles whose names and titles blurred together in her nervous state. Yet with each interaction, her confidence grew incrementally. She noticed Lady Marjorie's approving nod from across the room, Captain Reynard's subtle salute with his wine glass, and the growing looks of genuine interest replacing initial skepticism among many courtiers. At the high table, Dorian seated Elaine to his right, a position of highest honor that sent another ripple of whispers through the assembly. Lord Emerin, placed at her other side, leaned closer as servants began presenting the first course. "You're doing remarkably well," the elderly magistrate observed quietly. "The court is already warming to you." "Not all of them," Elaine responded, nodding discreetly toward where Lord Merrick sat with his allies, their heads bent in conversation that seemed unlikely to be favorable to her cause. "Merrick represents old thinking," Emerin said dismissively. "He fears change because his power derives from maintaining the status quo. But look there." He indicated several younger nobles watching her with open curiosity. "The next generation is more concerned with justice than with rigid adherence to traditional hierarchies." Throughout the meal, Elaine navigated the unfamiliar customs of formal dining by watching others and following Dorian's subtle cues. When the music began and couples took to the floor for dancing, she prepared herself for embarrassment, until Dorian leaned closer. "I've instructed the musicians to begin with a simple country circle," he murmured. "Nothing complicated for your first court dance." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, though I fear my dancing skills are another area where my servant's education is sorely lacking." "Then allow me to begin your instruction," he replied, rising and offering his hand. As they took the floor, other couples joined the circle. The dance was indeed simple, one she had seen performed at village festivals, though never had the opportunity to join. Dorian guided her gently, his hand warm and steady against hers. When the music ended, he kept her on the floor as a slower, more formal piece began. "This one is slightly more complex," he admitted, "but I'll lead you through it." Indeed, the movements were more intricate, requiring closer proximity and more precise steps. Dorian's hand rested lightly at her waist, the other holding hers at shoulder height as they turned in measured patterns across the floor. "You're a natural," he observed as she quickly caught the rhythm. "Perhaps your body remembers what your mind was never taught. Dance was an essential part of noble education, something your mother would have ensured you learned had circumstances been different." The thought of her mother, the noble lady rather than the humble seamstress of her childhood memories, brought a momentary pang that must have shown in her expression. "Have I said something to distress you?" Dorian asked immediately. Elaine shook her head slightly. "Not at all. I was just thinking about all she sacrificed to protect me. She gave up everything, her identity, her standing, her home, and lived as a village seamstress, always looking over her shoulder for Thalen's men. Her sacrifice ensured your survival," Dorian replied softly. "And now you have the chance to reclaim what was taken from both of you." As the music reached its final notes, he guided her through a final turn that brought her closer to him than the dance strictly required. For a heartbeat they remained thus, her hand in his, faces mere inches apart, the rest of the court momentarily forgotten. Then applause broke the spell, and they separated with proper decorum. The evening continued with more dancing, conversation, and careful observation of court dynamics. Elaine noticed several nobles who had initially kept their distance now approaching to engage her in conversation, a positive sign that her acceptance was growing beyond mere acknowledgement of Dorian's favor. It was nearly midnight when a commotion at the hall's entrance drew everyone's attention. Captain Reynard entered hurriedly, making directly for the high table where Dorian had just returned to his seat. He bent to whisper urgently in the king's ear. Dorian's expression darkened instantly. "What is it?" Elaine asked as Dorian rose. "Trouble," he replied tersely. "I must attend to this immediately. Please, continue enjoying the festivities." But the warmth had gone from the evening with his departure. Elaine sat through another half-hour of increasingly strained conversation before Lord Emeron touched her arm gently. "I believe His Majesty would welcome your presence in the council chamber," he said quietly. "Lady Marjorie will escort you through the side passage to avoid unnecessary attention." Minutes later, Elaine was ushered into a room where tension hung in the air like a physical presence. Dorian stood at the head of a long table, his face grave as he examined documents spread before him. Captain Reynard and several council members, notably excluding Lord Merrick, were engaged in heated discussion that ceased abruptly at her entrance. "What's happened?" she asked, moving immediately to Dorian's side. He looked up, conflict evident in his expression, concern for her warring with the need to share difficult information. "Brooks has fled the castle." "The archives secretary?" Elaine clarified. "The one you suspected of leaking information to Thalen?" "The same," Dorian confirmed grimly. "Guards discovered his quarters empty during the evening patrol. He took several documents with him, including copies of the evidence Lord Emeron brought regarding your heritage and Thalen's illegal exploitation of the Varel mines." Elaine's heart sank. "Then Thalen will know everything we've discovered." "Worse," Reynard interjected. "We've also received reports that Thalen's forces are mobilizing along our eastern border. Not just regular patrols, Significant troop movement suggesting preparation for military action. He means to silence us before the magistrates' conclave can convene, Lord Emeron said, his aged voice trembling slightly. Or at least create enough regional instability to delay the proceedings. Elaine studied the maps spread across the table, detailed renderings of the border regions and the territories once belonging to House Varel. "Where is Lord Merrick?" she asked suddenly, noting his conspicuous absence. "Also missing," Dorian replied, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Though he made a more convincing show of it, claimed illness and retired to his chambers before Brooks's disappearance was discovered. By the time we thought to check on him, he was gone, along with his personal secretary and valuables. "So our suspicions were correct," Elaine said softly. "He was Thalen's agent all along." "One of them, certainly," Dorian agreed, though I suspect his motivation was primarily financial rather than ideological. Merrick has extensive investments in Thalen's silver trade, investments that would be worthless if your claim to those mines were recognized. A heavy silence fell over the room as they all contemplated the implications. Finally, Elaine spoke the question uppermost in everyone's mind. "What do we do now?" Dorian straightened, his features settling into the resolute expression of a king making difficult decisions. "We accelerate our plans. Lord Emeron, send messengers tonight to the magistrates. Explain the situation and request an emergency session within the week rather than the fortnight originally proposed." "They may not all be able to attend on such short notice," Emeron cautioned. "Then we proceed with those who can," Dorian replied firmly. "We need enough for a quorum, not unanimity." "And militarily?" Reynard asked. "Deploy additional forces to the eastern border immediately," Dorian ordered, not as aggression, but as a clear signal to Thalon that any incursion into our territory will be met with full resistance. "And what of Lady Varel?" one of the council members asked. "Her safety must be a primary concern, especially now." All eyes turned to Elaine, who straightened under their scrutiny. "I will not hide while others risk themselves for my cause," she said firmly. "If I am truly the heir to House Varel, then I must be willing to face whatever dangers that entails." "Admirable," Dorian acknowledged, "but strategically unwise. Your testimony is essential to the case against Thalon. If anything happened to you before the conclave—" "Nothing will happen to me," Elaine interrupted with uncharacteristic boldness, "because I will be under the protection of Harwald's finest soldiers, including, I presume, their king." A tense moment passed between them, her determined gaze locked with his concerned one, before Dorian's expression softened slightly. "Very well, but you will accept additional guards and certain limitations on your movements until the conclave convenes." "Agreed," she conceded, "though I insist on continuing to participate fully in all strategic discussions." As the council meeting continued late into the night, plans were formulated, messengers dispatched, and defensive positions established. By the time dawn lightened the eastern sky, Harwald was quietly mobilizing for a confrontation none had anticipated when the evening's festivities began. Elaine found herself alone with Dorian in the council chamber after the others had departed to execute their various assignments. He stood at the window, watching the first golden rays illuminate his kingdom, his shoulders bearing the visible weight of leadership. "You should rest," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "You've been awake all night." "As have you," he replied, glancing at her with a tired smile. "Still in your court finery, no less." Elaine looked down at her blue velvet gown, now somewhat rumpled from hours in the council chamber. "I hardly noticed. There were more important matters at hand." "That ability to distinguish between what truly matters and what merely appears important is rare," Dorian observed, "especially among those born to privilege. Perhaps my unusual upbringing provided some advantages after all," she said with a small smile. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the castle grounds come alive with morning activity. Servants, soldiers, and messengers all moving with greater urgency than usual, responding to orders most didn't fully understand. "I never intended to bring Harwald to the brink of conflict," Elaine said finally, voicing the guilt that had been growing within her through the night's discussions. "Perhaps it would have been better if you had left me in Thalen's dungeon." At least then your kingdom wouldn't be facing potential war. Dorian turned to her fully, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Never say that, he said with quiet intensity. The confrontation with Thalon was inevitable. If not over your claim, then over some other grievance. He has been expanding his power at the expense of his neighbors and his own people for years. Still, she persisted, I cannot help feeling responsible for the current crisis. You are not responsible for Thalon's crimes or his desperate attempts to conceal them, Dorian replied firmly. He hesitated before adding in a softer tone, and selfishly, I cannot regret any circumstances that brought you to Harwald and into my life. The admission hung in the air between them, more significant for its timing, spoken not during a dance or scenic garden walk, but in a moment of crisis when pretense fell away before more pressing concerns. Elaine felt warmth rise to her cheeks even as a strange calm settled over her heart. Nor can I, she replied simply. Whatever happens at the conclave, whatever becomes of my claim to the Varel lands, I am grateful for these weeks in Harwald, for discovering who I truly am, and for knowing you, Dorian. His name, spoken without his title for the first time, seemed to break some final barrier between them. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. When this is resolved, a sharp knock interrupted the moment. Captain Reynard entered, his expression betraying the urgency of his message before he spoke. Your Majesty, riders approach from the East Road. They bear Thalon's standard, but under a flag of truce. Dorian released Elaine's hand reluctantly, his demeanor shifting back to that of a ruler facing diplomatic challenge. How many? A small party, no more than 10, led by someone who appears to be a high-ranking official, not Thalon himself. An envoy, Dorian mused. Interesting. Have them escorted to the formal reception hall. Provide refreshment, but double the guard presence. As Reynard departed to carry out these instructions, Dorian turned back to Elaine. It seems Thalon prefers negotiation to immediate conflict. That gives us time, and perhaps leverage. What do you think he wants? Elaine asked. To silence us, certainly, Dorian replied grimly, though his specific proposal remains to be seen. He glanced at her court dress, now definitely showing the effects of an all-night council session. Perhaps you should change before we meet his envoy. Your presence will unsettle them, all the more so if you appear every inch the noble lady you are. An hour later, refreshed and wearing a new gown of deep green with silver embroidery, Elaine stood beside Dorian's throne as Thalon's representatives were ushered into the reception hall. The leader was a tall, austere man with iron-gray hair and cold eyes that widened fractionally upon seeing Elaine positioned so prominently. Lord Chancellor Devereux, Dorian acknowledged him coolly. Thalon sends his second in command. We are honored indeed. The Chancellor bowed with precise formality. King Dorian, I bring greetings and concerns from His Majesty King Thalon. Concerns about what specifically? Dorian inquired, his tone deceptively casual. The weather, trade routes, or perhaps the unlawful exploitation of silver mines protected by international treaty? Devereux's composure slipped momentarily before he recovered. I see rumors and misinformation have reached your Majesty's ears. That is, in fact, why I have come, to clarify certain legal and historical matters before regrettable actions are taken based on incomplete understanding. How thoughtful, Dorian replied with dangerous pleasantness. And does this clarification include explaining why King Thalon is mobilizing troops along our shared border while simultaneously sending peaceful envoys? A precautionary measure only, Devereux assured him smoothly, given the increased activity of Harwald forces in the region. Responding to your own military movements, Dorian countered. But let us set aside this circular argument. What exactly does King Thalon propose? Devereux's gaze flickered briefly to Elaine before returning to Dorian. His Majesty offers generous terms to resolve this unfortunate situation. A substantial financial settlement to the lady, in exchange for her formal renunciation of any claim to territories currently under Thalon's sovereignty, Additionally, expanded trade privileges for Harwald merchants within our borders. And if these terms are rejected? Dorian asked quietly. Then King Thalan cannot be responsible for the consequences of continued provocations against his legitimate authority, Devereux replied, the threat barely veiled beneath diplomatic language. Before Dorian could respond, Elaine stepped forward slightly. Lord Chancellor, she addressed him directly, am I to understand that King Thalan now acknowledges my identity as the daughter of Lady Elenis and Lord Rowan? That represents quite a change from imprisoning me as a common thief and spy. Lord Chancellor Devereux's face remained admirably composed, though a muscle twitched near his jaw at Elaine's direct question. His Majesty recognizes that certain claims have been made regarding your heritage. The settlement offer acknowledges the possibility of such connections without necessarily confirming their validity. How diplomatic, Elaine replied with the slightest edge to her voice. Yet curious that King Thalan would offer substantial payment for claims he considers questionable. Dorian's lips curved in the barest hint of a smile before he redirected the conversation. We will need time to consider these terms, Lord Chancellor. I propose you and your party remain as our guests while we deliberate. His Majesty expects a prompt response, Devereux countered. The offer is time-sensitive. As are all matters of justice, Dorian replied smoothly. You will have our answer by tomorrow morning. Until then, I trust you'll find Harwald's hospitality satisfactory. After Thalan's envoys were escorted to the guest wing, Dorian immediately convened his inner council, including Elaine and Lord Emerin. The mood in the council chamber was tense as they debated the implications of Thalan's offer. It's an admission of weakness, Lord Emerin argued, his aged hands gesturing emphatically. He knows the legal case against him is strong, or he wouldn't resort to financial settlement. Or it's a delaying tactic, Captain Reynard countered. Every day the magistrate's conclave is postponed gives him more time to prepare militarily or seek support from other kingdoms. Elaine, who had been silent during the initial discussion, finally spoke. What troubles me most is the specific mention of my renouncing claims to Virel territories, but no mention of the silver mines or river access rights specifically protected by treaty. Dorian nodded appreciatively. An astute observation. The settlement would likely include language that appears to resolve all claims while actually preserving Thalan's most lucrative illegal activities. Then we should reject his offer outright, one counselor stated firmly. Not necessarily, Dorian cautioned. Refusing too quickly suggests we have no interest in peaceful resolution. Better to appear to consider it seriously while accelerating our preparations for the conclave. The discussion continued well into the afternoon, strategy and counter-strategy weighed with care. As evening approached, the council adjourned with a general consensus. They would delay their response to Devereux while continuing urgent preparations for the magistrates' gathering. Elaine found herself alone with Dorian in the council chamber after the others departed. He looked exhausted, the strain of recent days etched in the lines around his eyes. You need rest, she observed gently. As do you, he replied. Yet here we both are, still plotting and planning. I'm not used to idleness, she admitted. Even as a servant, my hands and mind were always occupied with tasks. Dorian crossed to the window, gazing out at the twilight settling over Harwald. What do you make of Thalan's offer? Beyond the political implications we've discussed with the council. Elaine joined him at the window, considering his question carefully. I believe it reveals his fear, not just of losing the silver mines, but of the complete unraveling of the narrative his family has constructed for decades. She paused, gathering her thoughts. If my claim is validated, it doesn't just challenge his right to certain territories, it exposes his father's crimes and casts doubt on his entire legitimacy as a ruler. Which makes him desperate, Dorian agreed. And desperate men make dangerous decisions. They stood in silence for a moment, shoulders nearly touching as they watched the castle torches being lit in the gathering darkness. Without looking at her, Dorian asked softly, If you were offered true restoration, not Thalan's hollow settlement, but full recognition of your rights and title, what would you do with Mooncliff and the Virel lands? It was a question Elaine had asked herself repeatedly since discovering her heritage. I would restore them, she replied simply. Not just the castle, but the prosperity my family once brought to those territories. The villages are impoverished, the farms neglected, the people taxed beyond endurance by Thalan's greed. A noble ambition, Dorian observed. But not a simple one, she acknowledged. I have no experience governing, no understanding of administration or diplomacy. She turned to face him directly. I know how to polish silver and turn down beds, not how to manage territories or negotiate trade agreements. Those skills can be learned, Dorian said, echoing his earlier reassurance about dancing. The more essential qualities, compassion, integrity, wisdom, cannot be taught so easily, and those you possess in abundance. His faith in her capabilities sent warmth spreading through her chest. You see more in me than I sometimes see in myself, she admitted softly. Perhaps I simply see you clearly, he replied, his voice equally soft. The moment hung between them, laden with unspoken feelings. Then a knock at the door broke the spell, and a servant entered with a message. Lord Chancellor Devereux was requesting a private audience with Lady Varel. Dorian's expression immediately hardened. Absolutely not. Any communication must go through proper channels. Wait, Elaine said thoughtfully. This might be an opportunity to learn something Thalan wouldn't reveal through formal diplomacy. It could also be a trap, Dorian countered, concern evident in his tone. We still don't know how much information Merrick and Brooks provided before their disappearance. Then let us compromise, Elaine suggested. I'll meet with Devereux in the small reception room. You and Captain Renard can observe from the adjoining chamber through the viewing panel. After brief deliberation, Dorian agreed to the arrangement. An hour later, Elaine sat composed in a high-backed chair as the Lord Chancellor was shown into the reception room. She wore a simpler gown than earlier, but the Varel signet ring was prominently displayed on her right hand, a silent statement of identity. Lady Varel, Devereux greeted her with a formal bow. I appreciate your willingness to speak privately. Not entirely privately, she corrected him, gesturing subtly toward the guards positioned at the door. But with sufficient discretion for honest conversation, I hope. Devereux took the seat across from her, studying her face with calculating intensity. You've become quite comfortable in your new role, he observed. One would hardly guess you were serving in Thalan's castle mere weeks ago. Perhaps because it isn't a new role at all. But my birthright, Elaine replied steadily. Though I suspect you didn't request this meeting to compliment my adaptation to noble status. A thin smile crossed the Chancellor's face. Direct and perceptive. Your mother had those same qualities. Elaine's heart quickened at the casual revelation. You knew her? I served in Thalan's court when she occasionally visited as Lady Varel. She was memorable. Something almost like regret crossed his features before disappearing behind his diplomatic mask. But you're right. I came to speak of more immediate concerns, specifically to convey certain aspects of King Thalan's offer that were unsuitable for the formal council setting. I'm listening, Elaine said cautiously. Devereux leaned forward slightly. The financial settlement would be substantial, enough to establish you comfortably anywhere in the realm. Additionally, King Thalan would officially acknowledge your heritage as daughter of Lady Elenus, though without recognizing territorial claims. And in exchange? You would depart Harwald immediately and permanently, Devereux stated bluntly, taking up residence in any kingdom except this one, with a sworn statement that you make no claims on Varel lands or properties. Elaine's eyebrows rose. He wants me separated from King Dorian's protection and influence. He wants to resolve this matter without bloodshed, Devereux countered. While King Dorian may have convinced you that your cause is just, he cannot guarantee your safety if conflict erupts, nor can he promise success at the magistrates' conclave. Many of those officials have deep financial ties to Thalan's silver trade. So my choices are exile with gold or potential failure and danger if I persist, Elaine summarized. Those seem unnecessarily limited options, Lord Chancellor. There is a third possibility, Devereux admitted, his voice dropping lower. One that King Thalan has authorized me to propose only if necessary. He glanced toward the guards before continuing. Marriage alliance, to one of Thalan's nephews, Prince Aldrich, a young man of impeccable lineage and considerable charm. You would be made Duchess of the Eastern Territories, governing the former Virel lands under Thalon's sovereignty. The offer momentarily stunned Elaine. It was politically clever, appearing to honor her heritage while effectively neutralizing her independent claim and separating her from Harwald's support. "And if I find this proposal as unacceptable as the others?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Devereux's expression hardened. "Then King Thalon cannot guarantee that the approaching conflict will spare anyone, regardless of bloodline or gender. War, once begun, follows its own brutal logic." "Is that a threat, Lord Chancellor?" "Merely a statement of historical fact," he replied smoothly. "One that a woman of your evident intelligence would be wise to consider carefully before rejecting reasonable terms." "I see," Elaine said, rising from her seat with deliberate calm. "I will convey your additional proposals to King Dorian and his council for consideration." "This offer was meant for you alone," Devereux protested, standing as well. "Not for Harwald's king to evaluate." "I make no decisions of such magnitude without proper counsel," Elaine replied firmly, "particularly when they involve threats thinly disguised as diplomacy." As guards escorted Devereux back to the guest wing, Dorian emerged from the adjoining chamber, his expression darkened by what he had overheard. "Marriage to Thalon's nephew," he said with barely concealed disgust. "A clever trap, disguised as an honor." "Yet politically astute," Elaine acknowledged. "It would give me nominal status while effectively making me Thalon's hostage." "You cannot seriously be considering it," Dorian said sharply, surprising her with his vehemence. "Of course not," she assured him. "But understanding his strategy helps us formulate our response." They were joined by Captain Reynard, who had also been observing the exchange. "The mention of magistrates with financial ties to Thalon's silver trade concerns me," he said. "If the conclave is compromised, we need only a majority ruling, not unanimity," Dorian reminded him. "And Lord Emerin has identified at least 4 magistrates beyond reproach." He turned back to Elaine. "Still, Devereux's threats cannot be ignored. We must accelerate our security preparations." Late that night, after further council deliberations, Dorian accompanied Elaine to her chambers where additional guards had been posted. They walked in companionable silence until reaching her door, where he paused, clearly troubled by thoughts he had kept private during the formal meetings. "What is it?" Elaine asked gently. "Beyond the obvious concerns we've discussed with the council." Dorian hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "When Devereux proposed the marriage alliance, for a moment I felt something beyond political objection. Something personal. The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than any formal declaration might have been. "I felt it too," Elaine admitted softly. "Not just rejection of Thalon's manipulative offer, but something more complicated where you were concerned." Dorian took her hand, his touch warm and certain despite his hesitant words. "These are dangerous times for personal feelings, especially between a king and a woman whose political status remains unresolved." "Yet they exist nonetheless," Elaine replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes," he acknowledged simply. "They do." For a moment they stood thus, hands joined and eyes locked in silent understanding of emotions neither could safely express more explicitly, while Thalon's envoys remained within Harwald's walls and crisis loomed at their borders. "Whatever answer we give Devereux tomorrow," Dorian finally said, "know that Harwald and its king stand with you, Elaine of House Virel, not merely for justice or political advantage, but because your cause has become important to me in ways that transcend statecraft. And your support means more to me than I can properly express," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever comes tomorrow, or at the conclave, or beyond, that truth remains constant." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the Virel signet ring, a gesture both courtly and deeply personal. "Rest well, my lady. Dawn will bring decisions that may shape the course of both our kingdoms." As he departed, and Elaine entered her chambers, neither could have known that far to the east, moving under cover of darkness toward Harwald's border, Thalon's elite forces were already advancing. Their mission not to wage open war, but to execute a single surgical strike meant to eliminate the threat to their king's power before the magistrates could ever convene. Dawn arrived with deceptive tranquility, golden light spilling across Harwald's eastern towers as the castle stirred to life. In the grand reception hall, Dorian sat upon his throne, the formal regalia of kingship settling heavily on his shoulders. Beside him stood his closest advisors, including Lord Emeron and Captain Reynard. Elaine was positioned at his right hand, dressed in a gown of silver gray with the Varel crest embroidered subtly at the bodice, a deliberate statement of identity and resolve. When Lord Chancellor Devereux and his delegation were ushered in, Dorian noted the tightness around the older man's eyes, a tension that suggested he had received new instructions overnight. Lord Chancellor, Dorian greeted him formally. We have considered King Thalon's proposals with the seriousness they deserve. Devereux bowed stiffly. And your response, Your Majesty? We find the terms unsatisfactory in their current form, Dorian stated, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. However, we remain open to negotiation under certain conditions. Surprise flickered across Devereux's face. Clearly he had expected outright rejection. What conditions do you propose? Dorian leaned forward slightly. First, immediate cessation of Thalon's military movements along our shared border. Second, formal acknowledgement of Lady Varel's heritage and legitimate claim to review the status of her ancestral territories. And third, agreement to abide by the ruling of the magistrates' conclave regarding the disposition of the silver mines and river access rights protected under international treaty. Devereux's expression hardened. These are not conditions for negotiation, Your Majesty. They are demands that presuppose the very outcomes King Thalon contests. They are prerequisites for productive dialogue, Dorian countered smoothly. Without them, we see little purpose in further discussion. Before Devereux could respond, the doors to the reception hall burst open. A royal messenger entered at a run, his face pale with urgency. He approached Dorian directly, whispering something that caused the king to rise abruptly from his throne. This audience is concluded, Dorian announced, his tone brooking no argument. Lord Chancellor, you and your delegation will remain in your quarters until summoned. He turned to Captain Reynard. Double the guard on our guests. No communications in or out. As Devereux was escorted from the hall, protesting the treatment of diplomatic envoys, Dorian gestured for Elaine and his advisors to follow him to the war room adjacent to the reception hall. Once the heavy doors closed behind them, he turned to the messenger. Report again, fully, he commanded. The young man straightened. Sire, our eastern watchtower spotted a small force moving through the forest pass at dawn. They wear Thalon's colors but travel under no banner. Scout reports suggest they're avoiding main roads and moving with stealth toward the castle. How many? Captain Reynard demanded. 20, perhaps 30 riders. Elite forces, heavily armed. Not an invasion, Lord Emeron observed grimly, but a targeted strike force. With a specific target in mind, Dorian added, his gaze shifting to Elaine, who had gone still at the implications. Me, she said simply, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to rise within her. Thalon never intended to negotiate. The diplomatic mission was merely a distraction while he positioned assassins. Or a kidnapping party, Reynard suggested. Taking you back to Thalon's dungeon would serve his purposes equally well and provide leverage against us. Dorian's face had set into lines of cold fury. Either way, it represents an unconscionable breach of diplomatic protocol and an act of war against Harwald. He turned to Reynard. Deploy the castle guard. I want every approach monitored and reinforced. What of Lord Chancellor Devereux and his party? Lord Emeron inquired. Keep them under guard, but unharmed, Dorian replied. If they're complicit in this treachery, they'll face justice. If not, they're still valuable diplomatic pawns. As preparations for castle defense proceeded around her, Elaine found herself pulled between conflicting emotions. Fear, certainly, but also a growing resolve that hardened like steel within her. When Dorian approached, concern evident in his eyes, she spoke before he could suggest what she knew was coming. I will not be hidden away in some secure chamber while others risk themselves for my protection, she stated firmly. Whatever plans you're making, I intend to be part of them. Dorian studied her face, recognizing the determination that had first drawn him to her in Thaylon's dungeon. "I wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise," he said finally. "But we must be strategic. Your safety is not merely a personal concern. It's central to our legal case against Thaylon and to the future of the Varel territories." "What do you propose?" she asked. "A deception," he replied. "One that gives us control of the situation rather than merely reacting to Thaylon's moves." As morning stretched toward midday, activity throughout the castle intensified. Guards were doubled at all entrances, servants restricted to inner passages, and preparations made that seemed bewildering to those not privy to the full plan. By early afternoon, Harwold Forest Patrol reported that Thaylon's forces had established a position in the woods less than 2 miles from the castle, close enough to move quickly under cover of darkness, but far enough to avoid casual detection. In Dorian's private study, final details were being arranged. Elaine stood by the window, watching distant storm clouds gathering on the horizon, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation to come. "Are you certain about this?" Dorian asked quietly, joining her there. "There's still time to adjust our approach." "I'm certain," she replied, turning to face him. "I've spent too many years in shadows, first as an unknowing child hidden by my mother, then as a servant invisible to those around me, finally as a prisoner in literal darkness. I won't hide anymore, especially not from a man who murdered my family and stole my birthright." Dorian's expression softened with admiration. "Your courage would do your ancestors proud." "It isn't courage," she admitted, her voice lower. "Not entirely. There's anger too, and perhaps even pride. After discovering who I am, I cannot bear the thought of cowering while Thaylon threatens everything and everyone I've come to care for." Her gaze held his, and in that moment, words unnecessary between them carried more meaning than any formal declaration could have managed. Dorian reached out, taking her hand in his. "When this is finished," he said softly, "there are matters we must discuss that have nothing to do with kingdoms or claims or ancient treaties." "Yes," she agreed simply. "There are." The intimate moment was interrupted by Captain Reynard's arrival with final reports. Preparations were complete. All that remained was to wait for darkness and for Thaylon's men to make their move. As twilight descended, a cloaked figure emerged from Harwold Castle's rarely used western postern gate, hurrying toward the stables with the furtive movements of someone attempting to avoid detection. Moonlight briefly illuminated a flash of golden hair beneath the hood as the figure mounted a horse and rode swiftly toward the forest edge. From the shadows nearby, 2 of Thaylon's advance scouts watched with keen interest. One immediately detached himself, slipping back toward their hidden camp to report this unexpected development. Within the hour, 15 riders moved silently through the forest, tracking the lone traveler who maintained a steady pace along the lesser-known paths heading east, toward the border, and beyond it, the neutral territory where the magistrates' conclave was to be held. "She flees to the Temple of Justice," their leader concluded, a cold smile playing across his scarred face, "seeking to place herself under the magistrates' protection before we can complete our mission. Clever, but ultimately futile." They increased their pace, closing the distance as the forest thinned and gave way to open meadowland. Ahead, the cloaked rider seemed unaware of pursuit, maintaining a steady but unhurried pace that suggested confidence in having escaped unnoticed. "Take her alive if possible," the leader instructed as they prepared for the final approach. "King Thaylon wants her silenced, not martyred." They broke from the forest edge in perfect formation, 15 riders fanning out to cut off any escape. The cloaked figure turned at the sound of their approach, seeming to freeze momentarily before spurring her horse forward in a desperate attempt to outrun them. "Surround her," the leader commanded. The trap closed with practiced efficiency, riders converging from all directions until the cloaked figure was forced to halt, surrounded by drawn weapons in a clearing bathed in moonlight. "Lady Varel," the leader called out, his voice carrying in the night air. "Your journey ends here. Surrender peacefully, and you will not be harmed." Slowly, deliberately, the figure reached up and lowered the concealing hood. Golden hair caught the moonlight, but the face revealed belonged not to Elaine, but to Lady Marjorie, her expression showing neither fear nor surprise at being captured. "I'm afraid Lady Varel sends her regrets," the older woman stated calmly. "She has a prior engagement." Confusion rippled through Thalon's men, quickly replaced by rage as understanding dawned on their leader's face. "A decoy. Search the area. The real target must be nearby." But even as he shouted the command, a more ominous sound reached their ears, the unmistakable ring of swords being drawn as figures emerged from concealed positions around the clearing. Captain Reynard stepped forward, the insignia of Harwald's elite guard gleaming on his armor. "In the name of King Dorian, you are surrounded," he announced, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Drop your weapons." The standoff lasted only moments before the leader of Thalon's force made a fatal miscalculation, charging toward Lady Marjorie with sword raised, only to be met by a precise arrow from the tree line that struck his shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The remaining men, realizing they were outnumbered 2-1 by Harwald soldiers who had been lying in wait, surrendered with varying degrees of reluctance. As Thalon's men were disarmed and secured, Lady Marjorie accepted Captain Reynard's assistance in dismounting. "I must say, playing the role of decoy was considerably more invigorating than my usual duties," she remarked dryly, "though I fear my riding skills aren't what they once were." "You performed admirably," Reynard assured her. "The real question is whether the second part of the plan was equally successful." Miles away, as Thalon's force was being captured, a small, heavily guarded party moved along a different route entirely. Elaine rode at its center, flanked by Dorian himself and 4 of his most trusted knights. They traveled not east toward the neutral territory, but north, following a secret path known to few outside Harwald's royal family. "Thalon's men will have taken the bait by now," Dorian observed, checking the position of the moon overhead. "Reynard will ensure they're held securely until dawn." "And Lord Chancellor Devereux?" Elaine asked. Facing some uncomfortable questions about his knowledge of the attack, Dorian replied grimly. "Though I suspect he'll claim ignorance of Thalon's true plans." They rode in silence for several minutes before Elaine spoke again. "I still don't fully understand why we're traveling north rather than directly to the Temple of Justice." "Because we're not going to the temple, not immediately," Dorian explained. "We're making a brief but crucial detour." As they crested a hill, their destination came into view in the valley below, a small stone fortress nestled against the mountainside, its windows glowing with welcoming light. "The Northern Keep," Dorian said. "My family's private retreat, known to few outside the royal household. And more importantly, the current residence of someone whose testimony will prove decisive at the conclave." "Who?" Elaine asked, curiosity overcoming her exhaustion from the tense day and difficult night journey. "Someone who has been in hiding for decades, protected by Harwald's crown since before I was born," Dorian replied enigmatically. "Someone whose existence Thalon would have gone to any length to eliminate had he discovered it." As they approached the fortress gates, which opened silently at their arrival, Dorian added softly, "Someone I believe you've been waiting your entire life to meet, though you didn't know it." Elaine's heart began beating faster as possibilities flickered through her mind. The small party dismounted in the courtyard, where servants waited with lanterns to guide them inside. Dorian offered his arm to Elaine, who took it with fingers that trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. They were led through warm halls decorated with tapestries bearing the Harwald crest, up a winding staircase, and finally to a comfortable chamber where a fire blazed in the hearth. Seated beside it was an elderly woman, her silver hair arranged simply around a face that, despite the lines of age, retained an unmistakable beauty. She looked up as they entered, her blue eyes, startlingly familiar, widening with emotion. "My God," she whispered, rising slowly from her chair. "It's true. You've found her." "Lady Elenis," Dorian said formally, "may I present your daughter, Elaine of House Varel?" Elaine stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process the reality of the woman before her. The mother she had believed dead for decades, the noble lady whose identity had been hidden beneath the guise of a village seamstress, now revealed as very much alive and protected in secret by Harwald's royal family. "Mother," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. The elderly woman stepped forward, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. My daughter. My beautiful, brave daughter. She reached out with trembling hands to touch Elaine's face. I never thought I would see you again in this life. But you died, Elaine said, confusion warring with joy. When I was a child, the fever. A necessary deception, Lady Elenis replied softly. Thalon's men had discovered our village. There was no time to flee together. The fever was real, but I recovered in secret while loyal friends spread word of my death. I was brought here, to Harwald's protection, while you were moved to the safety of Thalon's castle, the last place they would look for a virile heir. You've been alive all this time? Elaine asked, disbelief slowly giving way to wonder. Here? Safe but separated from you, the most painful sacrifice a mother could make, Lady Elenis confirmed, her voice breaking. But necessary to protect the last hope of House Virel, and the child I loved more than life itself. As the two women embraced, tears flowing freely between them, Dorian quietly withdrew to the corridor, giving them the privacy this extraordinary reunion deserved. Outside he found Lord Emerin, who had traveled ahead to prepare for their arrival. You've done a remarkable thing, Your Majesty, the elderly magistrate observed, reuniting mother and daughter after all these years. Justice is rarely achieved through legal channels alone, Dorian replied. Sometimes it requires patience, secrecy, and a willingness to protect truth until the moment it can safely emerge. Like the truth of your own feelings for Lady Virel, Emerin suggested with the directness age and long service permitted. Dorian's gaze returned to the closed door, behind which decades of separation were being healed with tears and whispered explanations. Some truths must wait for the right moment, he said quietly. First, we secure her rightful place in the world. Then, and only then, might I presume to suggest she consider a place in mine. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of the Temple of Justice, casting prismatic patterns across the ancient marble floor. The grand hall, with its semicircular arrangement of stone seats rising like a theater around the central speaking platform, had witnessed centuries of legal proceedings, diplomatic negotiations, and the occasional trial of high-ranking nobles. Today, it would host perhaps its most significant conclave in a generation. Magistrates from 7 kingdoms filled the uppermost tier, their formal robes in varying colors denoting their realms of origin. Below them sat witnesses, advisors, and observers from across the United Kingdoms. At the center of it all stood the speaker's circle, a round platform of white marble where those presenting evidence would make their case before the assembled authorities. Elaine stood in an antechamber, her heart racing despite her outward composure. She wore a gown of silver blue, the traditional colors of House Virel, with her mother's recently returned necklace, the crescent moon and star pendant hanging at her throat. The signet ring gleamed on her right hand, a tangible connection to the heritage she had only recently discovered. Nervous? Dorian asked quietly, joining her at the window where she watched latecomers hurrying up the temple steps. Terrified, she admitted with a small smile, though I'm trying not to show it. You've faced Thalon's dungeon and assassination attempts, he reminded her. A room full of magistrates should pale in comparison. Different kind of fear, she replied. In the dungeon, I had nothing to lose. Here. She gestured toward the great hall beyond the door. Everything we've worked for hangs in the balance. My mother's testimony, Lord Emerin's evidence, my own identity. All will be questioned and scrutinized. Dorian moved closer, his presence steady and reassuring. Truth has a way of asserting itself, especially when presented with the dignity and strength you bring to everything you do. Before she could respond, the door opened to admit Lady Elenis, supported by Lord Emerin. Though frail with age, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of nobility, her silver hair arranged simply but elegantly beneath a delicate circlet that marked her rank. It's time, she announced, her voice stronger than her physical appearance might suggest. They're ready for us. Elaine took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then let us not keep justice waiting any longer. They entered the great hall in formal procession. Lord Emerin first as the presenter of the case, followed by Lady Elenis, whose appearance caused murmurs of shock to ripple through the assembly. Then Elaine, her resemblance to her mother unmistakable despite the decades separating their primes. And finally, King Dorian, whose presence signified Harwald's official support of their petition. At the opposite entrance, King Thalan made his own entrance with considerably less ceremony. His narrow face was taut with barely suppressed fury, his eyes darting between Lady Elenis and Elaine with open hostility. Behind him trailed Lord Chancellor Devereux, recently released from Harwald's custody after lengthy interrogation, and several nervous-looking advisors. The Chief Magistrate, an elderly woman from the neutral Western Isles, struck her ceremonial staff against the floor 3 times, bringing the assembly to order. "We convene today," she announced, her voice carrying effortlessly through the hall's perfect acoustics, "to hear evidence regarding the contested territories of the former House Virel, the legal status of the silver mines and river access within those territories, and the claim of inheritance brought by Lady Elaine Virel, with supporting testimony from Lady Elenis Virel, previously believed deceased." She fixed Thalan with a stern gaze. "We will also address the matter of diplomatic violations committed against Harwald, including the unauthorized incursion of armed forces across sovereign borders and the apparent attempted abduction of Lady Virel while peace negotiations were ongoing." Thalan rose immediately. "These alleged violations were the actions of rogue elements within my kingdom, acting without royal authority. I categorically reject responsibility for—" "You will have your opportunity to present your case, King Thalan," the Chief Magistrate interrupted firmly. "For now, we will hear the initial evidence supporting Lady Virel's claim." What followed was a methodical presentation of documents, testimonies, and physical evidence. Lord Emerin presented the original marriage contract, establishing the special protected status of the silver mines and river access. Lady Elenis testified to the events following Mooncliff Castle's fall, her flight with infant Elaine, the years in hiding, the painful decision to separate from her daughter when Thalan's men drew too close. "I believed she would be safer as an anonymous servant in Thalan's own castle than as a hunted child at my side," Lady Elenis explained, her voice catching. "The household steward who placed her there was one of the few who knew my true identity. He promised she would be protected, educated quietly when possible, and kept far from Thalan's direct attention. And yet King Thalan eventually imprisoned her," the Chief Magistrate observed. "What changed?" "The necklace," Elaine spoke up, touching the pendant at her throat. "I had kept it hidden all those years, but one day while cleaning the royal chambers, a visiting noble saw it when it slipped from beneath my dress. He recognized the crest of House Virel." Thalan's face darkened at this revelation, confirming its truth more effectively than any protestation could have done. As the proceedings continued, Dorian presented evidence of the illegal mining operations that had drained wealth from the protected territories for decades. Maps, financial records, and testimony from former officials built an irrefutable case that the silver mines had been exploited in direct violation of international treaty. When Thalan finally rose to present his defense, his arguments seemed hollow against the weight of evidence mounted against him. He questioned Lady Elenis's identity, only to be countered by 3 independent witnesses who had known her in her youth. He challenged the validity of the ancient treaty, but the original document with all royal seals intact refuted his claims. As the afternoon wore on, his position weakened visibly with each failed counterargument. When he finally resorted to veiled threats about regional stability should his authority be undermined, the Chief Magistrate's patience visibly thinned. "We are concerned with law and justice here, King Thalan, not political expediency," she stated firmly. "If your rule depends upon illegal seizure of protected resources, perhaps the stability you reference was built on shifting sands to begin with." By sunset, as torches were lit around the hall, the magistrates retired to deliberate, leaving the assembled witnesses and petitioners to wait in tense silence. Elaine found herself seated between her mother and Dorian, drawing strength from both as the minutes stretched into hours. "What will you do?" Dorian asked quietly. "If the ruling favors your claim, I mean." Elaine considered the question carefully. "Restore what was broken," she said finally. "Mooncliff Castle, the villages, the proper management of the mines for the benefit of the people rather than a single ruler's coffers." "A worthy ambition," he acknowledged, "though perhaps an overwhelming task for one person. even one as capable as yourself." Lady Elenis, overhearing this exchange, smiled knowingly. "Perhaps not for one person alone," she suggested, glancing meaningfully between her daughter and the king. Before either could respond to this gentle prompting, the magistrates returned to their seats, their expressions solemn but resolved. The chief magistrate took her position at the center of their tier, staff in hand. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this conclave has reached unanimous decisions on the matters before us," she announced. "Regarding the claim of Lady Elaine Virel to the territories and titles of House Virel, we find her claim valid and legally binding. She is hereby recognized as the rightful Duchess of Mooncliffe and all associated territories." A murmur ran through the assembly, though the outcome had seemed increasingly inevitable as the day progressed. Regarding the status of the silver mines and river access within those territories, the chief magistrate continued, "We uphold the binding nature of the treaty establishing these as protected resources under the direct control of House Virel, regardless of broader territorial sovereignty. King Thalon's exploitation of these resources without proper authorization constitutes a violation of international law." Thalon's face flushed crimson with rage, but he remained silent, aware that any outburst would only damage his position further. "On the matter of reparations," the magistrate proceeded, "we order an audit of all profits derived from the silver mines since their illegal seizure, with 50% of calculated proceeds to be paid to House Virel over a period of 5 years. Now Thalon could contain himself no longer. "This is outrageous," he protested, rising from his seat. "You would bankrupt my kingdom over technicalities and the testimony of a woman who hid like a coward for decades." "Silence," the chief magistrate commanded, striking her staff forcefully. "Your disrespect for these proceedings only reinforces our final judgment regarding your diplomatic violations against Harwald." She turned to address the full assembly. "The unauthorized incursion of armed forces across Harwald's borders, combined with the attempted abduction of Lady Virel during peace negotiations, constitutes a grave breach of diplomatic protocol. As penalty, King Thalon will surrender direct administrative control of the former Virel territories to a council of neutral governors for a period of 3 years, after which Lady Virel will assume full governance." "And if I refuse these terms?" Thalon demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then you place yourself in opposition to the united judgment of all 7 kingdoms," the chief magistrate replied evenly. "The consequences of such isolation would be severe, diplomatically, economically, and potentially militarily." The threat was clear. Comply or face united sanctions that no single kingdom, however wealthy, could withstand. Thalon's gaze swept the hall, finding no allies among the assembled dignitaries. Even his own advisors had begun edging away, distancing themselves from his increasingly untenable position. After a tense moment, he offered a stiff bow. "The ruling is acknowledged. My representatives will coordinate with the appointed governors." Without another word, he turned and strode from the hall, his retinue hurrying to keep pace. As the assembly began to disperse, congratulations flowing toward Elaine and Lady Elenis from all directions, Dorian remained quietly at their side, his presence a steady anchor amid the swirl of excitement and relief. "It's over," Elaine said wonderingly as the reality of the ruling began to sink in. "After all these years, justice has finally been served." "Not over," Lady Elenis corrected gently. "Merely beginning. The restoration of our house and lands represents a new chapter, not an ending." "Your mother is right," Dorian agreed. "The Conclave's ruling provides the legal foundation, but the true work of rebuilding lies ahead." As they made their way from the Temple of Justice into the early evening air, Elaine found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had transpired and what awaited her. From servant to duchess, from anonymity to responsibility for territories she had never governed, all in the span of mere months. Sensing her uncertainty, Dorian drew her aside to a quiet alcove in the temple gardens, away from the continuing congratulations and diplomatic conversations. "You look troubled for someone who has just achieved a historic victory," he observed. "Not troubled," she clarified. "Overwhelmed. I know who I am now, but knowing doesn't automatically prepare me for the responsibilities that come with that identity." Dorian's expression softened with understanding. No one expects you to transform overnight from who you've been to who you're becoming. The transition will take time, guidance, support. From the neutral governors, you mean? From them, yes, he acknowledged, but also from others who care about your success. He hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic hesitancy. I promised myself I would wait until your position was secure before speaking of certain matters that have nothing to do with politics or territorial claims. Elaine's heart quickened at the shift in his tone. I believe I made a similar promise to myself. Then perhaps, he suggested, taking her hands in his, both promises have been fulfilled, and we might speak openly of what has been growing between us since that first meeting in Thalon's dungeon. I think, she replied softly, that would be entirely appropriate. Dorian's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands as he gathered his thoughts. When I first saw you in that cell, something in your dignity despite terrible circumstances called to something in me that I hadn't fully recognized was waiting to be awakened. As I came to know you, your intelligence, your compassion, your quiet strength, that initial spark deepened into something I can no longer pretend is merely political alliance or even friendship. Nor would I wish you to pretend such a thing, Elaine responded, her voice barely above a whisper. Not when my own feelings have traveled a similar path. His eyes searched hers, hope and uncertainty mingled in their depths. Even knowing the complications that would arise, a king of Harwald and a duchess of reclaimed territories, our alliance would have profound political implications. Perhaps those implications would be beneficial to both our peoples, she suggested. Though that's not why my heart has chosen as it has. Why then? He asked, wanting, needing, to hear her speak the truth between them. Because in you, I found someone who saw value in me when I was nothing but a prisoner without name or title, she answered simply. Because your honor and compassion reveal a man I would choose regardless of crown or kingdom. Because when I imagine rebuilding what was broken, I cannot picture that future without you beside me. The last light of sunset illuminated them as Dorian drew her closer, one hand rising to gently trace the curve of her cheek. Then perhaps the most important question remains. Elaine of House Virel, restored Duchess of Mooncliff, would you consider a union that joins our hearts, our lives, and eventually our territories in a bond stronger than political alliance alone? Are you proposing marriage, King Dorian of Harwald? She asked, a smile spreading across her face. With all the diplomatic skill at my disposal, he confirmed, his own smile matching hers. Though I find myself rather less composed than when negotiating ordinary state matters. Then yes, she replied, certainty filling her voice. I would consider such a union not merely acceptable, but the fulfillment of hopes I scarcely dared acknowledge, even to myself. As he leaned forward to seal their understanding with a kiss, neither noticed Lady Alanus watching from a discreet distance, satisfaction and peace evident in her aged features. The circle was complete. House Virel would rise again. Justice had prevailed over decades of wrongdoing, and her daughter had found not only her rightful place in the world, but love that transcended the boundaries of station and circumstance. 3 months later, as spring bloomed across the United Kingdoms, a very different gathering took place at Mooncliff Castle. The ruins had been partially restored, enough to host the most significant ceremony in the region's recent history. In the ancient Great Hall, before representatives from all 7 kingdoms, Elaine of House Virel and Dorian of Harwald exchanged vows that bound not just 2 people, but 2 realms in promise of shared prosperity. From darkness to light, Dorian said softly as they stood together on the castle's highest accessible terrace afterward, overlooking the territories that would now flourish under their joint protection. That seems to be our story. A story still being written, Elaine replied, her hand finding his as they watched sunset bathe their lands in golden promise. But with a beginning I could never have imagined that day in Thalon's dungeon. And a future, he added, drawing her close, that we will build together, one day at a time. Below them, the silver river caught the last light of day, flowing freely once more. Like justice, delayed but ultimately unstoppable in its course toward where it was always meant to be.